Yeah, but there's lots of reasons why hunting is not conservation at all. I'm sure everybody here can understand why. I mean, conservation at its core is literally protecting and preserving um, environmental resources, and unfortunately, animals fall under those resources. And yeah, through some lying and kind of misinformation within the hunting community over decades, a lot of people have been convinced that hunting is a critical part of conservation, but it's not. And the population of hunters has been decreasing since, at least in the U.S., since about 1980. So the population's declined by like 50% of registered hunters. Now, of course, there are hunters who participate, illegally, and we probably don't have great stats on that. But still, the population of people who want to go out and be violent with wildlife, is decreasing, and more people are enjoying the outdoors through things like birding, foraging, and nonviolent activities. So we really need to reassess what our view as a society is of conservation. Yeah, foraging for mushrooms is great. That's kind of my shift. I mean, I was a hunter for about 26 years. I grew up in a family that was big into hunting, and as I realized more and more that it was unnecessary, and I also realized through scientific evidence that it was actually detrimental to ecology, through a lot of our land management practices and also through the extraction of wildlife from ecosystems. And then I also, began to empathize with animals, more so than just dogs and cats that I was trained to. So that really changed my perspective on hunting as a form of conservation. But yeah, a lot of hunters will say that the North American model for conservation, which essentially relies on there's a few different principles of the North American model, but at its core is a reliance on hunting as kind of a main driver for conservation, both in funding but also in just participation in conservation. But over the last 40 years, here in the United States, with the declining population of hunters, we've had to reassess our strategies for conservation funding. And now, basically, 80 to 90% of conservation funding in the United States comes from non-hunting sources. So hunting is no longer a viable, source of funding, and this also causes detriment to our ecosystems. So we definitely need to reassess what our thoughts on conservation are, and how that relates to hunting. Yeah, definitely had to get away from the hunting. I mean, I was raised that way. I mean, that's was just part of the culture I was raised in. And it wasn't until I educated myself about plant-based diets, and ecology more so, that I really started to question, like, is hunting, like, important culturally and environmentally? So yeah, yeah. Does it depend who you are hunting? Great. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, who should we hunt? I mean, some hunters on here advocate for hunting cats and dogs. I've seen people that say that they have the right to unalive dogs that just wander onto their property, and I think that's absolutely ridiculous. And I think that that highlights the inherent violence people have, just towards animals for no reason. I understand if a dog's coming onto your property and causing damage or threatening, maybe your family or something like that. But even so, there's nonviolent ways to handle those situations. So I don't think that the violence of, hunting, or using weapons to protect your family from animals is really necessary. Even for things like bear, and mountain lions and larger predators, there are nonviolent solutions, that you can use, like air horns, or bear spray. So there's tons of ways to protect yourself, in nature, non-violently. But yeah, this is my new generated background. Oh, is this a hunter? Hunting isn't conservation. Imagine how many more deer car accidents there would be if we stopped. Yeah, so actually, it's funny you say that because most of the populations of deer are a result of our land management practices. So hunting, kind of, it doesn't make sense, to a lot of people, but hunting and the demand for hunting actually increases populations of these animals that you're wanting to hunt. So if you want to decrease the population of deer, we should change our land management strategies to not just focus on deer populations and increasing those for hunters, but we should also consider rewilding, and reintroducing predators potentially, or other nonviolent means of, managing populations. Deer meat is so good. Yeah, plant-based food is far better though. So you can go out and forage. You can find some really awesome mushrooms all year around, especially if you're in a wet climate. So there's tons of other alternatives to deer meat, especially since that's not really great for you. And if you look at the probability of getting foodborne illnesses, like worms and things like that, stick to the deer meat if you want some foodborne illnesses. It's funny how many people say that that's like a clean source of protein. It's like, yeah, I mean, maybe if you're in the middle of, a huge national park, you might could say that. But, even in the country, people are dumping all kinds of stuff in the woods. And unfortunately, wildlife get into that. Good worms and deer. I don't know about that, man. Good worms in deer. Yeah, interesting. A lot of comments from hunters in the comments here, but nobody's coming up to try to debate. So if anybody wants to discuss this topic, I'd be happy to discuss it with you. I am a former hunter, so I probably know all the arguments you're going to try to make. So I'd love to discuss this topic with you. DNR considers hunting as conservation when done legally. So you're telling me the Department of Natural Resources, who manages deer populations as resources, tells you that the thing that they're helping you do is good? That's wild. That's crazy. Who would have guessed? I'm just messing with you, bro. I respect your decision to be vegan. Okay, thank you. But if you want to come up and debate, why hunting's not conservation, I'd be more than happy to. I hunt at the grocery store. Yeah. Right, exactly. So you can hunt, plant-based foods, and not go and hunt for, flesh and body secretions of animals. And you can also forage, if you want to go out in the woods and enjoy nature, there's foraging, which is far more ethical and sustainable. Hey, what's up, Landon? Nate Dog. Hey, girl, I think I've talked to you before. I guess you're talking to me. Hey. Still under the impression that people with Crohn's can go vegan. I mean, from the research I saw, it's very possible. But again, I'm not a nutritionist. I would recommend you talk to a nutritionist. Veganism isn't about being perfect, and there are people who, in some very specific situations cannot have a fully plant-based diet, and that doesn't necessarily make you not vegan. You can be, vegan and avoid animal products as best you can. A lot of people think being vegan is about perfection and you can't be vegan if you drive a car or if you step on an ant. Like these are just ridiculous appeals to futility. So if you really care about animals and you care about your health, I would recommend you look into a plant-based diet and look for nutritionists that are also educated on the topic. There's Challenge 22 is a great resource. Yeah, that's soy man to you. That's right, CR. Let me tell you again, it's not possible for most people with Crohn's to go vegan. I'm one of them. I mean, again, Nate Dogg, you maybe you don't have to. Maybe there is something that you need from animal sources. I really don't know that much about Crohn's disease, to be honest. So I'm not the one to sit here and tell you that you gotta eat a certain way. Yeah, but maybe Landon, Nate Dogg, if you want to talk to Landon sometime, he does a lot of lives. He says his wife has Crohn's and is vegan, so it's possible. Girl, I've already tried that. I've already been there. Okay, I mean, again, there are resources. I would ask you, have you talked to, a nutritionist? I don't know, but that's not the topic today. Feel free to give Landon a follow. He's here in the comments, and you can talk to him maybe sometime about nutrition and how that works with Crohn's disease. Yeah, that's what I read too, ALX. Like Crohn's disease actually can be mitigated through a plant-based diet. So, and because of the anti-inflammatory properties. Now, so, maybe some people have certain allergies or something like that. But yeah, many crones are vegan. Yeah, I think the problem is that a lot of doctors aren't educated on plant-based diet, and even a lot of nutritionists aren't. A lot of dietitians aren't. So you kind of gotta do your own research and then try to find somebody that might align with what you found in the research. Hi, I'm Jerry, the carnivore hunter. Jerry, why don't you come up and talk to me? I'd be happy to chat with you. I hunt for meat. Yep, and I forage for mushrooms. You can participate in non-violent activities outdoors that don't harm sentient creatures. What if someone legit doesn't like plant-based food? So like there's none of the like 20,000 vegetables. You've tried all 20,000 vegetables and probably like 60,000 different fruits that exist in the world. That's pretty wild. If you've actually done that, that's insane. But yeah, to say you don't like a plant-based diet and you've had like a fraction of the plant-based foods available in the world, like that's kind of ridiculous. A lot of commenters in the comments, but nobody coming up to debate. Hunting is fun. Yeah, and foraging is fun too. There's all sorts of outdoor activities that you can do that don't involve the exploitation of sentient creatures and don't inflict suffering on those beings. So I'd encourage you to look into foraging. There's thousands of different plants that you can forage in most areas. And typically there's at least 10 to 20, pretty simple to identify mushrooms. You do have to be careful with foraging, just like with any kind of outdoor activity that where you're getting something for food, like you got to know what you're looking for. But I think that, makes you smarter. It encourages you to connect with nature more. So you don't support abortion then, right? I'm not sure what that has to do with conservation. All right, we've got Zach. So you don't support abortion then, right? I'm not sure what that has to do with conservation. All right, we've got Zach. What's up, Zach?
Hey, brother, how's it going?
Pretty good. How are you doing, man?
I'm amazing. How was your Christmas?
Yeah, wasn't bad. Wasn't bad. Nice and relaxing. How about yours?
Yeah, mine was amazing, man. Just spent it with family. So I have approached a veganistic lifestyle whenever I enlisted into the military. But another point, I still have not fully converted to veganism because I do enjoy the ability to hunt for prey, like, how we did back in the day before humans were able to mass, G-side against animals. We're like the hurt worse. But no. So what about invasive species like anacondas in Florida? I think
Yeah.
that is conservation because they cause detrimental effects to wildlife if they're not eradicated. And we don't even do enough eradicating. The rest of Florida will tell you that. I mean, I love anacondas. I've had albino ball pythons and I've had other animals, but I know these anacondas are a problem, dude. They eat people's dogs. They take people's pets and just murk them all the time. So invasive species hunting is conservation, in my personal opinion. Could we agree on that or no?
So I could argue that there are alternatives, though, right? So there are alternatives to population control with any animal or plant when we look at invasive creatures. So I don't think that hunting is the only alternative, to population control. There's other things we can do. And I do want to touch on the point, like you mentioned, animals, and pets that are getting taken by anacondas. Like that's something I get so frustrated with. A lot of people here in my area, because I'm deep in the country, and a lot of people just open their door and let their dog outside, or they have outdoor cats that they just feed outside. And
Yeah,
honestly, I
man, we
think
got
that's
coyotes out in Tennessee. They eat them up in the
right.
Smokies, man. Yeah, I understand that point. But, like, anacondas are unstoppable because they constrict these pets, and then these pets can't fight back. Because when they bite them, the anaconda just tightens its grip, causing more detrimental effects. I've understood the concept of trapping and rehoming, but at the same
Mhm.
time, it is so much harder to trap and rehome. By the time you get one trapped and rehome, but you could have the ability to take out 20 to 30 of the 10,000 that are extra that we cannot have because it's destroying the wildlife or the ecosystem within itself, the invasive species. Like kudzu, even as a plant, is the same difference in Appalachian areas. They're both the exact same, in my personal opinion. One kills plants, the other kills animals. You know what I mean? And mass efforts too.
Yeah, so two kind of we've kind of shifted here from animals onto plants, but I mean I've got tons of kudzu on my property, and I actually work with kudzu. If you're familiar with the introduction of kudzu, kudzu was actually introduced to the United States by the U.S. government to help with erosion control, as well as to be a fodder for animals or for animal feed. So historically, it had benefits, and we worked with it. But then farmers kind of let that go, and we shifted to more grains and hay, better hay production. So there was less need for this alternative fodder. So that's kind of why has become a problem, because it's no longer being worked with. So I think a lot of times, like, it's easy for us to put this anthropocentric perspective onto species. And something like the Burmese python in Florida, like that is a human caused problem, right? Like those snakes got there because humans were releasing them, because they were neglecting the animal in their care. It got too big, and then they were like, well, I'll just release it into the Everglades, right? So that is human neglect, I would say. In the
Yeah,
same way
humans
that
suck. I can agree with that. Humans do suck, just going off of that point. But at the same time, they were trying to. You can't even reverse an effect like that that's so detrimental because of how fast those things reproduce, like on the scale they reproduce. So there's no way to reverse it, but minimizing the damage that we've caused by promoting invasive species like that. I might have said it wrong. It might not even be a boa. I thought it was a boa constrictor, but like the big ones, but like the
yeah,
12-foot ones. You know what I mean?
I think those are the Burmese pythons that are taking over the Everglades, taking
Yeah,
over.
yeah. No,
But
I wouldn't even
but
say taking over with quotations.
No, well, I would, because I think a lot of times that goes back to my point on the anthropocentric perspective. A lot of times when we're talking about invasive species, we're looking at it on, like, what is the impact of human society, right? Like, a lot of hunters will bring up like feral pigs and their destruction to, like corn and other agricultural practices. And we're talking dollar amounts, right? And that's typically a lot of times how we're looking at these invasive species, is how is their impact on the human species in general. But a lot of times it is on biodiversity. But if we're looking at a longer time period, these changes in environments and the migration of animals and plants has been happening for millions of years. So when we're sitting here and we're saying, well, this animal is invasive, well, most of the time we introduce them, right, intentionally or unintentionally. And
Yeah, like
secondly,
Hurricane Katrina. We people weren't just releasing them into the Everglades; they were in Hurricane Katrina. You're right. Yeah, I can agree with that.
yeah, so I would argue that, it's not the snake's fault that it's there. It's not the feral pig's problem, that it's there. And by us saying that you matter so little that we want to just unalive you and eradicate you, extirpate you, I think is a disservice to the individuals, right? And if you are against, like, factory farming and say farming in general, or what's your view on, like, the exploitation of animals for food?
Oh no, man! I actually despise it. I worked in a chicken factory and saw the way that chickens are treated and covered in formaldehyde, and how we eat that in a mass quantity through Tyson. Tyson was our biggest competitor that bought us, and
Yeah.
and it's horrible. The mass and the fish farming. The fish farming is even more disgusting because the systems they live in. Salmon parasitic worms are horrible. Humans cause
Right.
that detrimental effect to salmon. Wild caught salmon does not have that issue. But what I would agree with, going off of your point originally, like the prompt, is in Tennessee we have a really big problem with white-tailed deer, and overpopulation of white-tailed deer causes chronic wasting disease because
Did you
there's
say
more of
Tennessee?
them. Sorry.
Did you say Tennessee?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So
Middle Tennessee towards the Smokies.
yeah. So a lot of the Southeast is having not overpopulation, but overabundance. So that term overpopulation is a very specific term um, when it comes to ecology. So overpopulation means that an animal or a species, with inside of an ecosystem has reached the carrying capacity for the ecosystem, right? So that means, like, deer are overgrazing things to where there's, like, no forest growth, or they're getting to the point where they're taking out all of their food. So typically, what I think you would mean, and what most hunters mean when they say overpopulation, is overabundance, and that just means there's a ton of them, right? And I would point to that having a few reasons. The first of which is our land management practices, right? So hunting as a form of conservation tends to fund the land management towards increasing these game animal populations. So that actually increases the population artificially, right? So every hunter that I know, and again, like I grew up hunting, so I know the practices that hunters do. Hunters like to clear land and make food plots for animals, like deer and turkey, right? So that's increasing the carrying capacity in the local environment. That allows for more deer or more turkey to exist. So hunting oftentimes increases those population sizes, right? Whereas if we were doing things like predator reintroduction, or focusing on the ecosystem health more in general to have healthy trophic systems, right? The predators, mesopredators, prey, and then plant and flora and fauna. If we were looking at conservation as a whole, we wouldn't be having these issues with overabundance of animals. So I think oftentimes we can see that hunting actually contributes to increasing these populations of animals like deer.
Well, that's where I'll beg to disagree. You got to split the term game hunting and food hunting, because a lot of people who are doing the land clearing and food piles and spraying, they all are game hunting. A lot of those people don't eat the deer; they sell the meat that they get from it and the antlers and the taxidermy heads from all of it. They don't do it for the love of the animal; they do it for the love of the game of taking the animal's life. But
Well,
the big problem, sorry.
Zach, I was going to say it's actually illegal as part of the North American model for conservation to profit off of wild animals. So what you're talking about is essentially poaching.
Yeah,
You
that's what it
know,
is. It's domestic poaching.
so would you argue that there's more poachers than there are like legal hunters?
I wouldn't argue that it's a problem with numbers. It's more a problem of occurrences for both situations. Because normal hunters that go out and they take maybe two deers, track one deer the whole season, end up with two max. Those people aren't causing detrimental effects. It's food piles and land habitat destroying. That's the big problem. And those are from game hunters. And I know that because I grew up on the Appalachians hunting deer my whole life. Um, but another point I'd like to bring up is because you brought up reintroduction of predators like the wolves in the at Yellowstone. That was
Yep.
a good thing. That was an amazing thing because of what I said with chronic wasting disease is a very hard problem. Chronic
Right.
wasting disease is one of the worst issues we have in East Tennessee and Middle Tennessee, and it's very hard to control animals and their disease relating issues because whenever you have one bad apple or one bad deer with chronic wasting disease, it promotes the other ones to having the same spoilage of the same disease, causing them to need over or to need not underpopulation but regulated population, and that's why we have hunting seasons, not just one time where you're allowed to hunt with one caliber. It's not the case at all. I just don't like. It's more of an issue of I understand reform, but it's probably the problem is game hunting and poaching. It's not the hunters themselves. So that's the separation I'd like to disagree with. It's not hunting
But
as a whole.
I would like to refocus though, like on my earlier point about land management practices, right? Like if we're looking at state land management practices through state DNR, like I live here in South Carolina, and they rotate through different like wildlife management areas, WMAs, and they'll do clear cuts and they'll do certain food plots for increasing the population of deer and turkey and quail, and these game animals. So it's counterproductive to both argue that we have too many animals while also like funding practices that increase the animal populations, so I think there's a contradiction there. And that's why I would argue, like, even just semantically, hunting at its core is the unaliving and exploitation of wildlife, right? And so conservation is the protection and preservation of wild resources, right? So hunting is in direct contradiction to conservation practices, right? Can you like agree with that?
Yeah, I can partially agree with that on the major scale, but minusculely, if you take out like Appalachian hunters that are going out and getting all their meat for one winter because they do not eat store-bought meat, they're not able to. A lot of these people that live up in the mountains, they don't like coming down to go buy ground beef or ground turkey every 3 weeks, or they don't like buying a bunch of vegan products that tend to have a less shelf life. These people do it for a reason. They have deep freezers built for this scenario. They're not overly consuming this meat. They're consuming enough to sustain themselves for a year or till the next hunting season. So I would agree that it's the minority that isn't the problem. It's the majority contradicting that statement, not the minority of the normal people who aren't hunting for game. A lot of
Like,
people
so
do
just
hunt for game and food, but I'm talking about people who do not use the animal.
I would argue that that's the majority of people. You know, like most people are going to the grocery store, right? And they're buying their factory farmed meat, or they're going to restaurants or fast food places and they're buying their factory, raised meat, and they're buying vegetables, right? And then they're going and hunting, and that's just like extra food, right? It's seen as like almost like a luxury to have a freezer full of animal flesh from the wild. Like that's at least how I've been raised, and I know impoverished people around me, like I have friends who do the same thing. Like most of their food is not coming from wild game. So I would very much argue that most people are hunting for fun, but also that the added benefit of having that. So I think
Yeah,
trying to
that's a good
argue
point.
that,
That is
that
a good
yeah,
point. The only
yeah.
thing
So
I'd like to
I don't
ask you
think that
though, I'm
and
so
I don't
sorry to
think that
interrupt. Oh,
justifies. I don't think that justifies our view of like hunting as conservation either. Like conservation is trying to protect these resources, while hunting, and if most people are doing it for fun and just kind of extra subsistence, or extra kind of calories, like that is in direct contradiction to our efforts for conservation on a wider, more broad perspective on conservation of trying to protect land, water, wildlife, in a biodiverse way.
that's a really good point. That is a really good point. But I'd also like to ask you something about the concept of conservation itself. So you're a vegan, correct? Do
Yeah.
you consume honey by chance or honey byproducts of any form? Okay.
No, I do
Well, I
not.
would just like to you to know that veganism for honey, people who do consume honey while proclaiming a vegan lifestyle, they indirectly result in the death of over 4 million bees whenever they transfer their honey to the states. That's a very hard issue that I'd like to bring up because a lot of the
Yeah.
veganism practices do not allow actual veganism to help the animal. It instead allows the person to feel better about not being personally related to taking that animal's life or taking their habitat. They just see it as, oh, I'm not eating meat, so I'm doing the right thing. But instead, the process of how those things are collected, like honey and
Yeah.
other things of that nature, I don't really know because I'm not too big on it. But I know honey is a really big issue for the bees and their habitat loss. And these people are
Yeah.
mass producing this, and then they say on the labels, all organic, all natural. You know what I mean? These people see that as a good thing, but these things are still harming the habitat of that animal, so they're not necessarily vegan. There's a lot of practices
So
within
Zach,
veganism that are unethical.
I would like to correct you a little bit. So veganism, it seems like you're talking about a plant-based diet. So people on a plant-based diet are eating primarily plants, but they're not necessarily taking a moral stance against the use of animals like vegans are. Now I know that there's
Well,
a
I know
lot of
what veganism
confusion.
is. Correct me if I'm wrong. Isn't it not using any byproduct that results in animal loss of any form, habitat, or natural life?
So it's the opposition to the use or exploitation of animals. So even things like riding horses, or having a dog for a certain purpose, or going to zoos, like all of these things would be the use or exploitation of animals that a moral vegan would be against. So there's a huge distinction between like plant-based diets, which could include things like honey. It could even include some animal products, right? Versus a vegan who is taking a moral stance against the use or exploitation of animals. So, and I would like to mention too, like honeybees, like I agree with you, like honeybees is a huge problem. And here in my area, like a lot of people want to be beekeepers. And so they'll capture wild European honeybees, and they'll try to keep them in these boxes. And right at the end of the year, after the bees have collected all this pollen and created all of this honey to get them through the winter, the beekeeper comes and takes the honey from them, right, and gives them like sugar water essentially. Now,
Well,
obviously,
even though
a
those
vegan.
honeycombs that they make are still their habitat that are being destroyed in the process of collecting honey. My uncle is a honey collector. He's a
Yeah.
beekeeper, and he showed me the process. I've been around him. I hate bees personally. I do not like getting stung. I don't know how he does it, but at the same time, I recognize that it does cause habitat damage to their home. Even if the habitat looks tiny to us, it's still their habitat. That's their
Yeah.
home. Like it's not. It's a man-made nest, yes, but they're
Yeah.
they're still being destroyed.
And it's quite literally, exploiting them for their food that they are making. It's stealing their food. And a lot of beekeepers don't understand the ecological impacts of beekeeping. So here in North America, the European honeybee is actually invasive. It is considered an invasive species because they will propagate and they will spread and they will start to live in trees. They will live outside of these beekeeping, hives, and they compete. They actually outcompete a lot of our native bees. So a lot of beekeepers don't understand that, and they think that, oh, well, it'll just help with pollinating my garden, or all of these things, when in fact, it has a direct impact on biodiversity. So that beekeeping is another issue that would conflict with true conservation, because if we're
Yeah,
focused
that's what I was
on
about to ask you. Is that also not considered hunting, even though it's not using any form of, detrimental effects with a pew pew or a knife or anything like of that matter, or a trap? It's still causing detrimental effects to the health of those. And since they are invasive, would it not be conversation to just take those out?
Yeah, so that would be where I would come back to the invasive species argument, right? And looking at it as like, well, what is the impact of the species, right? And what is human contribution to it? And if we look at it, the keeping of bees is contributing to the invasiveness of these species, right? Of bee species. So if we wanted to approach the problem of invasive European honeybees in North America, the first place we should go to is the beekeepers, right? Like, I mean,
Uh,
that's just a common sense thing, right?
let me ask you something. I'm not trying to pivot. I just have a question. So, in the same concept, you said that you were raised around people who kept game, like deer, for personal reasons that were game reasons, alongside of the benefit of having the meat.
When
It was for the love of the hunt.
when you say keep, do you mean like that would hunt
No,
these?
yeah, process, and keep those into fridges. Okay, well, I have another point. Who do you know that has enough? Because I want you to think about this. One deer produces enough meat to stuff the top part of a two-part fridge or the bottom part of a two-part fridge. Two deer is enough to fill a deep freezer, at least. Okay. Who do you know is keeping a mass amount of these deep freezers or locations for this meat? I have yet to meet another hunter in Tennessee who has enough for this. This is like the most drastic claim I've ever heard. These deers are not being overhunted. I mean, I can agree they're being overhunted by a minority, like I said, but the majority does not have enough storage for these amounts of animals you're saying that their lives are being taken.
Are you familiar with like hunt clubs? Have you ever been part of a hunt club?
No, I don't associate myself with people who hunt for game.
Yeah. So what happens in a lot of areas is large landholders, we're talking like hundreds or thousands of acres, will get a group of guys together. The guys will pay a fee to enter into the club, and then they will typically share the deer that are unalived on that property. And a lot of times these hunt clubs also have large freezer systems where they store the meat. If they are indeed processing it. But here in South Carolina, there's deer processors, so a lot of hunters don't even process their own deer anymore. They just take it just to like a butcher, who would do it for them, which I think is a little like, you're
I don't know.
missing
I
the.
understand having a processor, but I've never heard of something like a hunting club in the majority. But like my point was, the minority or the majority hunters who are taking a minority of the deer population, like one or two or three or four, you know what I mean? Even if you get four deers in a season, you did something good, or you cheated, you used a feed pile, or you sprayed. But the majority of hunters that live in the Appalachians where the deer population is overpopulated, we would not see those people putting three deep freezer worths of meat in there. Does that make any sense? Nobody
Yeah,
has three deep freezers for meat.
I definitely understand what you're saying, but I think most of the time in those situations they're sharing the meat, which is what it is. They typically share it with family members or friends, and I mean that happens in our community. But what I would put forward is that that is still not necessary. Like if we're talking about conservation, the again, like all of the things I outlined, like it increasing the population of deer, both through gender bias hunting, so which eliminates the best buck and the best looking, the largest doe, that you can get. That kind of impacts the genetics, and it also decreases the competition within these herds of animals. So that in and of itself raises the population, as well as the land management practices happening at a state and a private level. to increase the population of these animals. And it's not necessary, like hunting is not necessary. Like we established, most people are going to the store and they're buying animal products anyway, or they're buying
Yeah, but if
vegetables.
we had no animal product mass farming through these factories, we would be hunting for our own food or homesteading chickens if you wanted pollos. You know what I mean? Like, it is not. Sorry, you can go ahead and
But
rebuttal
but
against
none
that
of
if you
that's
want.
necessary. But I would argue none of that's necessary and it's detrimental. Like if you care
Well,
about
no, there's certain
conservation and you care
proteins.
about
I
the
mean, we can
management,
extract proteins from other sources, but most proteins we need come from meat. We can't get them all from soy.
like what proteins or amino acids.
I forget. It's like certain enzymes that are in the meat help brain function at a young age.
Yeah, so this isn't true. That's actually common carnivore misinformation. So I would encourage you to look up the American Dietetics Association and their stance on a vegan diet. They say that a vegan diet is appropriate for all ages, both for pregnant women and for children, and that it can actually provide health benefits, whereas meat tends to be correlated with negative health outcomes. We're talking heart disease, obesity, cancer. So to try to argue that we need meat is just factually incorrect.
I feel like okay, that's a good concept. I was just talking about the enzymes that are easierly accessible through meat. If you can get everything from one source, you're not going to need to go and search for it in supplements. Okay, like for instance, ones that allow you to have that necessary daily dose of whatever that supplement would be, like magnesium or iron, anything of that nature. I don't really know which. I understand what you said. Go search up the vegan diets that dietitians approve at any young age or pregnant women.
Yeah,
But
exactly. It sounds like your point here is like what I hear a lot about, like nutrient density, maybe,
yeah,
in
it's
meat.
very easier.
But do you want to just eat one thing when you have meals? Like, are you only sitting down to like just have a plain hamburger with no bun and no pickles and no ketchup or mayonnaise or anything else? Like, you just
Well,
want to
no,
eat
I'm
like.
an omnivore. I'm an omnivore. Or no, there's another term. We're not even omnivores. We're the primate. What are they called? They're like nuts and berries and things of that nature. That's the same way that our teeth and how
Yep.
our digestive tract is set up. I know
You're
that
on
it's
it.
not omnivore.
You
Huh?
know what's up, Zach. You know what's up, man. Like that. I mean, that's true. We're frugivores because we're
Yeah,
great.
yeah, frugivores. That's
So,
the word I was talking about. We
so
frugitate
that,
and we go around and we look for shit. That's how we used to do. We used to forage. But I do have a
yeah,
question. I feel like your concept of minor hunting is what we would call pen hunting or fence hunting. It's where these animals are on homesteads and they're being raised just because they look good. They have really good genes. Like these deers are beautiful. They're 12, 16 pointers, albino
yeah.
deer with fat heads. You know what I mean? Their hooves are massive. These are big animals. And I think that's what your concept is because people pay to go there to get those animals. It's not the
Yeah.
hunting that's the problem, it's the over hunting that's the problem. There should be less, or we should have reform on the limits that we're allowed to do because of the fact, like I brought up, chronic wasting disease.
Yeah, so I mean, earlier your argument was that there's too many deer and we need to hunt because there's too many deer. And now it seems like you're saying that, we don't need to hunt, or like I'm not really
No,
sure. It
no,
feels
no.
like
We
you're
need
kind of
reform.
flipping up.
Sorry, let me rebuttal that. We need reform against how we hunt. Not just a certain amount needs to be less. We just need better hunting qualities. Like the hunting that we do cause detrimental habitat damage. And as a hunter myself, I know what it's like to, sit out there for a whole season waiting, sitting. You know what I mean? Not causing detrimental habitat damage while promoting a pile of feed that'll go bad within a year.
I
These
thought you said you weren't a hunter. You were specifying like the difference between a game hunter and like a subsistence hunter, or what? Because now you're saying you're a hunter. So what can you like
uh,
define the difference between hunting and game hunting?
Yeah, game hunting is whenever you go and you treat it like a trophy almost. It's poaching basically. It's domestic poaching. While whenever you're I guess what you would say a food hunter or a sustainability hunter, you're hunting for personal reasons that afflict with you. That way you do not have to consume overconsumption through animals. These people they don't have to take 14 deer if two of them will suffice for the entire winter. That's what it means.
I feel like maybe we need to define these terms a little bit better because poaching is like illegal hunting. And then like I think you're talking more about like trophy hunting. And
Well,
Game
trophy
hunting
hunting is what I
before,
mean. Unethically
yeah,
hunting is the best way to put
okay.
it. It's not poaching, but domestic poaching would be the best way to put it because we both can agree it's unethically correct or it's wrong. You shouldn't be doing it for the game. You should be doing it for the animal if you want that meat. You shouldn't be doing it so you can have antlers hung up or a taxidermy in your bedroom. That's not the reason you should be hunting. You shouldn't be hunting
Well,
for the
yeah,
flaunt.
I mean, I would go back to my earlier points, Zach, that it's not necessary, right? And that, to the topic here, like it is not part of conservation. It is in direct contradiction to conservation. And if, we've already talked about overpopulation and how hunting actually contributes to overpopulation or overabundance of animals. We've talked about the difference between subsistence hunters and maybe game hunters, but I would argue that oftentimes game hunters are the same as what you're talking about, because some game hunters, like I grew up doing a lot of bird hunting, right? Like duck and doves. So we would get the hunt club together and you'd go out and sit on the pond or you go out in the field and you'd hunt these birds and you would try to get your limit and you would take those home and you would process them yourself and you would consume those animals. But that doesn't justify us going out and doing that just because it's a tradition or that we're getting something from nature. Like we most of us, like we already established, are going to the store and we're buying these other products that are in direct contradiction to a lot of the things we're talking about under conservation of like land use, resource use and conservation. So I think it's like not very fair to try to argue,
Well, what do
that.
you mean by that? So, are you saying that we should ban farm fishing and farm production or farm processing of animals that are in factories? Factory processing of these animals. Factory farms is what I mean. Like these farms that aren't real farms, they're incubator machines and cattle lines, and they're horrible for the environment and the animal's well-being itself, producing lower quality meat, like I said beforehand, with the worms inside of salmon that we never experienced before, and the difference between wild-caught salmon and domesticated salmon. Just another example I would like to ask you, are we supposed to ban all of the forms of uh, farm factoring or factory farming?
Well, I mean, as I stated, like my position is in veganism. So obviously I don't agree with any type of use of animals, right? Like if you treat that cow the nicest you could and you unalive it to eat it, I still think that that's immoral, from my position because it's
Yeah,
unnecessary.
but that's
We can eat other
subjective.
plants.
That's
I would
subjective.
agree. I would agree, but through empathy, we can have moral objectivity, right? So, like, if I know that, let's say that I thought that kicking a dog was the best form of exercise, right? And you obviously, I'm sure you would say that's ridiculous, man. You can do all of these other things besides kick that dog for exercise. You can go lift weights, you could go run. Why are you going to kick that dog? That's my same position on the animal exploitation, whether it comes to hunting or whether it comes to
Well, give me
buying
an
meat.
example of what you mean with the conservation. How else are we supposed to conserve these animals in the way that we're attempting to, while also providing the benefits that we gain from having these animals killed? Even if you don't gain from it, a lot of people who do would enjoy the ability to have these resources. Because a lot of people, not a lot of people, especially nowadays, because you know how it is when we have cheaper, more readily available ultra processed foods. These people aren't exactly doing that, but there's a lot of people who live natural lifestyles. It's not just a small, group of people that are hillbillies that are doing it. It's a good majority of people that live in rural areas. We can both agree because you said that you brought up dove and duck hunting or geese hunting.
It's not a majority though. So like I don't know if I said it here, but I said it kind of in the intro probably before you had joined. But the hunting population has been on decline since about 1980. And that's registered hunters. Now, of course, there's people hunting illegally and all of that, but again, registered hunters have been on the decline for about 4 to 6 decades. So if we're talking about like sustainability or something like that and how that's important to conservation, I think that's a moot point, because there are far more people who are interested in like backpacking, hiking, climbing, birding, photography, that are going to national parks, that are paying those same entrance fees, that are contributing to conservation. Then there's far more of those people than there are hunters, right? And we also need to make this distinction again between hunting and conservation. Hunting is exploitation, right? And conservation is preservation and protection.
I
So to
don't
say
agree with
that,
that first statistic. Sorry to cut you off, but you have to understand that a lot of people who are hunting have family and children that are hunting that are not under hunter licenses. So they're not registered to be the same scenario. We have people who are 16 and under who hunt more than the average American.
They have to be registered to hunt though in the United States.
Not in Tennessee. They don't. Your hunting license doesn't. No, no. I know because I hunted before I was 16 without one, and then when I turned 16, I got my hunting and fishing and game wildlife license from Walmart.
I think you're right. Like under 16, I think you can hunt with an adult.
That's
And
the thing
follow
I'm
their
saying, and it's only
Okay.
counting that one adult, not the rest of the tags that are coming from the child or the
But so
other family.
you said you were disputing the stats I provided about the decline in hunting population.
Yeah, because that only registers to the people who are registered hunters, not the people who bring alongside with them those people.
So that just seems like a weird thing. You could still say that it's in decline though, right? Like if there are less registered people,
No, there's just less
I
people
didn't
who
cite
are not
specific
able to
numbers,
be registered yet or are not
but
going
but
to
I
get registered.
but I didn't cite specific numbers. I just cited the decline in registered hunters. So either you're arguing that
No,
these
you said
kids are
hunters.
coming up.
Hunters. You didn't say registered hunters to begin with. You just said hunters. The decline in
I think I said
hunters.
registered. I think I said registered hunters, but I would, take that back if I did say hunters. But I mean, registered hunters since 1980 have decreased by 50%.
Yeah, well, I just remembered you saying hunters. I didn't hear registered in front of that. However, if we could, rewind the tape, we would. But I just heard hunters. But at the same time, I had to let you understand that it's not just registered hunters who are hunting. It's their children and their family members who are under 16.
But I think that's irrelevant to the point I'm making, right? It's like even if you say, okay, well, there's actually 5 times as many hunters than registered hunters, we're still seeing declining population rates. And we also see in surveying of U.S. citizens that the sentiment towards hunting is actually like bad. Like most people disagree with hunting. They don't see it as a valid form of conservation. Most people, and I think you probably kind of mentioned this too, most people are against the culling of predators, which is part of the North American game model. Issuing tags for bears, coyotes. Actually, coyotes are in most states free for all.
Yeah,
Hunted.
no. We should definitely be marking coyotes, in my personal opinion. They've killed wildlife. They do not help with domesticated wildlife like chickens. I've seen that firsthand on multiple occasions of wolves, not wolves, coyotes. Wolves ain't a problem in Tennessee. They really ain't. We might have some up on the Great Smokies, but they're not, hunting the animals that we have. But
So
coyotes are.
what's your problem with coyotes then? Because you mentioned like you were for the reintroduction of predators, and the coyotes here are literally becoming the apex predator in our ecosystems here in the southeast and most of the eastern United States. And they
What?
are technically native because they originated in the deserts. And through climate change and migration, they have expanded their range into the
Do you
eastern
think a
U.S.
coyote is killing a deer, my friend?
Yeah, so coyotes do impact the deer populations. This is well documented. You can see their
What?
impact on fawns.
I'm so sorry. I love to talk to you, but I just won't agree with that. And I just, because,
It's actually, I really love that you have brought this up because I actually had hunters in my comments recently who were like, what hunter doesn't think that coyotes or bobcats impact, prey population?
well,
So I'm really
bobcats and coyotes are very different. Coyotes tend to be very small, weak individual animals. They're not very strong. I've whooped a coyote's
glad.
ass whenever I was like 12.
Please go to my page after we're done talking and look at the videos I've just posted. I've been tracking coyotes on my property, and some are bigger than the largest dogs that we've rescued. And we have Great Pyrenees. Coyotes can be big, and they not only can they take down full-grown adult deer, which is rare. I'll give you, it's rare
Yeah,
that they
that is
take down
very
full-grown
rare. I mean,
deer.
every
But
blind
listen,
fish gets
listen,
a
Zach,
worm.
please, please, Zach. They do impact populations of these animals because they're not just hunting adult deer, right? They're hunting the weakest deer. Oftentimes that's fawn, which yes, that sucks and that's a horrible reality, but that is impacting the deer population by reducing the fawn survival rate. They are also hunting the diseased animals that hunters don't want to kill, right? Like a hunter doesn't want to kill a limp, lame deer. Maybe they would if they believe in conservation and helping with the genetics of that population. Maybe they could argue that they would take that deer out and go just bury it or leave it for the wildlife or something. But that's still like to argue that coyotes or bobcats have no impact on large game populations is very, very dishonest, or it's ignoring a lot of the evidence that we have for their predation on the young of the animals as well as the old.
Nobody is killing fawns. I just disagree with that statement. Nobody is running up to a fawn and kamikazing it with a knife because they don't want to waste ammo on it. It's just not logical, my friend. They're
When did I
not.
say that, buddy?
You brought
You're
up
making some
fawns.
weird
You
claims
brought up
now.
lame
Yeah,
deer.
we were talking about the predation of coyotes. Are we not?
Well, I just had to bring up your point was wrong though. It's not. We're not taking out fawns. No hunter takes out fawns except for a really
All right,
crappy one.
Zach, I'm not sure what you're arguing here because I'm been very clear that we're talking about coyotes. So like I'm not really sure why you're bringing up that hunters are going after fawns. Like that's absolutely ridiculous. I never said that. I was talking about I was talking about the predation from coyotes onto fawn and young deer. So um, let's see. Andy, I'll bring you up. If any other vegans want to come up, hang out. Hey, what's up, Andy?
Hey, obviously they left just before I got up. But I was just going to say, I mean, obviously it's completely different where we are in the UK because our deer population have no natural predators other than big dogs who often do take down deer and kill them. I mean, we still have deer hunting in the UK, which happens with packs of dogs. But actually, what I wanted to say was in regards to sort of just the coyotes, even if they were completely unsuccessful, right? Let's just imagine they were completely useless. They're still going to move those herds around, which is exactly what happens here when we have fox hunting. So the fox hunting dogs will not chase a deer naturally, right? It's a different kind of dog. However, they move these herds of deer all around the woods when they're out hunting. And actually what happens is if you correlate when hunts are out in areas versus road traffic accidents, they're massively high because the deer are scattered out of the woods. And obviously our country compared to yours is much smaller. So there's not too many places where they can go where they don't end up having to cross a road or a train track or somewhere else. So even if these animals, like the foxhounds, don't actually pose any natural threat to them, they still disperse them, they still move them around, they still affect their breeding patterns, all these different things. So to just say they don't affect it is, it's just complete ignorance because
Yeah,
we don't even have coyotes here, but we still see that effect.
Yeah, I think Zach was getting a little frustrated, and he was starting to have circular reasoning, and I don't know why he started making those weird claims at the end, but I thought it was a good conversation. But yeah, I mean, and we look at the differences between, predators in the ecosystem versus hunters and their impacts on genetics, on migration patterns, on browse of different plants. Like there's so many different things, that predators do differently in the ecosystem than hunters do. And predators have been doing it for millions of years. Like to argue that hunters are somehow going to have a better impact on these, ecosystems is kind of ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that a couple of people have told me this before, but like one of the biggest threats to, say, farm animals, from what I've heard, is quite often other people's dogs. And so, again, if people are going to deny that a coyote is capable of this, why are other people's dogs such a problem?
Yep. Yep. It's absolutely ridiculous. And I mean, coyotes, like I track the wildlife and I also track all of the neighborhood dogs that nobody has in their, in a fence or on leashes. And the coyotes do not get anywhere close to our housing, to our animals where our dogs are, to our chicken coop where the dogs are patrolling. They don't get anywhere close. But the ones that do get close are domestic dogs that are looking because they're comfortable with humans. Like wildlife tend to avoid humans. So to argue that, you need to do it to protect your family or animals is kind of ridiculous because most of these animals are not in a position where they're looking for, that kind of thing. But yeah. What's up, Ozark?
I just wanted to mention too, like the dead. I actually have a peer-reviewed article pulled up in front of me that mentions that coyote hunting really doesn't do much for the population of coyotes anyway. And the large reason why people consider coyotes a problem is because it affects animal agriculture. So I don't really care. Coyotes aren't invasive. It's just ridiculous.
Yeah. And I mean, I've even had in the comments over the last few days of some of my coyote videos, I've even had coyote hunters admit that they could hunt as many coyotes as they could, and it's not going to impact the population. And it's like, you're arguing against yourself. You're literally saying that you need to do it, but then it doesn't work. It's like such a stupid argument. But yeah, we've got some more requests. I see some requests to get
Oh,
some female
and I
hunters.
wanted to mention too, I know you have me as a mod, but if you need help managing guests or anything, I don't have those permissions, so I didn't know. Yeah.
Let me click on that. I'll have to check here. Let's see. Yeah, it's all good. I'm gonna keep it pretty chill right now. I think there was one guest that was saying, let me see, MFN Wayward. Let's see.
Hello.
Hello.
Can
Hey,
y'all
are you
hear me?
over 18? Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, I'm 44. I think I'm a little bit over 18.
Cool. Yeah, welcome to the live. What are your thoughts on hunting as conservation?
Okay, I grew up hunting for food.
Hmm.
There are people that will go do it for trophy hunting, and I don't agree with that. I was raised to not agree with that because no matter how you cook them, you cannot eat antlers. However, something I haven't heard you bring up where I live in Arkansas. I live in the part of Arkansas where we grow a lot of rice and a lot of crops like that. We have a ton of deer. We get a lot of ducks. My area gets a ton of income during duck season because out of state hunters will come and rent property. They will rent houses. They will, go to local businesses and they go do their thing. And some of them are jerks and some of them are nice and I don't care what they do. But what I have not heard brought up in states and areas like mine, deer can and will not only cause traffic accidents, but they will cause fatalities. We have lost one law enforcement officer ever here. He was responding to a call for backup, 5 o'clock in the morning, hurrying up to go help another officer on a domestic, and he hit a deer. 26 years old. Deer can and will
Yeah, I
cause
mean, sorry to
fatalities in
interrupt
traffic
you. That's
accidents.
obviously a tragedy, but what we need to understand is the
Can
deer
I
and their
talk,
habitat
bro?
pre-existed the road, right? So the deer aren't crossing the road crosses where the deer lives. That's the problem that we fail to recognize.
When
I live in
the
Arkansas too.
when they are under control, like it's not hurting anything. Okay, if somebody goes out and they get a deer, I don't know about y'all, but where I live, we got one
Until it
grocery
hurts the
store
deer,
in the
doesn't it?
entire county,
It hurts the
and they
deer.
know they can charge whatever they want. So there are people here that their kids would not be eating if they did not hunt. What I
So,
also haven't heard brought up is wild hogs, because you
no,
can take
I
a
figured.
small thing of wild hogs, like 3 or 4, and they can literally destroy an entire rice field, an entire cornfield in one night.
Yeah,
And
I
they
mean,
don't care what they eat.
domestic dogs can also do damage to property, but
Okay,
nobody's
that's where
advocating for going out.
I have a dog. I've always had dogs, and I have never had a dog that went out and destroyed a rice field.
Okay, I mean,
My
if we're
dog went
talking
out in the rice
anecdote,
field for any reason. It was to
when I
play in
was
the
a
water.
Yeah, I mean that anecdote doesn't mean anything, right? I've never had my house burnt down, luckily, but it doesn't mean that houses don't get burnt down.
Yeah,
But
I
you
live in
need to look at the
Arkansas
areas
too.
that you are talking about, because an area like mine, there literally are people that would not eat if it was not for being able to hunt.
I
There
live in
literally are
Arkansas
people.
too, and I just
so
wanted to mention that I live in a pretty big agricultural community as well, and the people that have the least amount of trouble with animals like deer and wild hogs are the people that take the time to put up deterrents such as fencing and other stuff like that. Those are the more successful farms in the area.
Yeah, and I would also like to point out the hunting is not cheap. Land access, for one, maybe you have a friend who lets you hunt. That's your best case for cheap land access. Weapons and ammunition are extremely expensive. Transportation costs can also be costly. So there's a lot of different costs involved with hunting that are often overlooked. It looks like you
Yeah,
did not.
I'm assuming she meant she runs some sort of Airbnb because she says she has people that come and hunt the ducks. Right, so
Mhm.
these people are paying not only to stay somewhere, but they're paying for their weapons, their ammo, their travel to get there, and that's the only way they're eating.
Yeah,
I think they should probably manage their budgets a bit better then, because they're not poor.
I don't really believe that there's only one grocery store in any county either. I know that there's counties that have like sparse, including mine, but that just seems a little bit far fetched, especially if they are bringing people in as tourists who go hunting. They're still gonna need to buy food while they're there and stuff like that. It just seems a bit out there to make that claim. And that cop probably wasn't wearing a seatbelt. Just saying, you know.
Yeah, no, I mean it's ignoring the actual real issue, isn't it? I mean that's obviously a tragedy for anybody, whether it's a fatality or not. But yeah, we're blaming the deer for essentially trying to cross over a road that in reality shouldn't be there.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I mean, it's worth repeating too. Like I've said, especially with
I mean,
Zach, probably like 5 times.
I mean,
You know,
you could swap, right? Imagine it wasn't a deer and it was a deer hound. Would there be the same victim blaming, or would it be this is a tragedy that a dog ran out and caused an accident?
yeah, yeah. And I mean, it's worth repeating too. Like a lot of the populations of these animals are from our land management for increasing the populations of these animals. So if we care about, there being too many deer in an area, well, maybe we stop making food plots. Maybe we stop, leaving pastures completely open for deer to browse, the corn remains at the end of the year. There's so many ways to address the population of deer through nonviolent means. And people want to justify their actions of hunting as a guise of conservation when they're literally contributing to increasing these population sizes. So it's a absolutely like circular, ridiculous argument.
I'll always continue to say it too. My neighbor's like the largest farmer in this county. And when we met and I told him what my intentions were, he specifically said, build a fence, it will protect your food. He's like,
Yep.
it has been extremely effective for me. Make sure it's about 7 feet high and just make sure it goes around what you want. And it's worked. I haven't had any issues. And I constantly have like large herds of deer going through my property now.
Have
Yeah.
either of you tried those like sound emitter devices that work almost? It's almost like on a supersonic frequency. So
I
humans
do that for moles and voles, and it's been extremely effective. It wasn't even an expensive investment either.
Well, I only asked because I was literally just reading. If I remember after the show's over, I'll grab the article. But I was just literally reading about a German farm that's just implemented one that covers something like 3 kilometers squared, one device, which I thought was. I mean, but it shows whoever's inventing this is inventing it with something in mind that's not veganism, right? It's like
Yeah.
profit. So all of these things that we get thrown at us, like you don't care about the little guys. What about this? There are other people that are actually factoring in this problem as much as we are, that are looking for solutions to it just so that they can make more money. So yeah, these are things that people are already looking to solve, but actually the people who aren't looking to solve this in any way, shape or form are the ones making the claim on TikTok, because you're directly standing in everyone's way, because you're perpetuating factory farming, which is using the feedlots, which is using the cheapest resources, which is using everything it possibly can, which stands in the way of this change.
Well, the thing that bothers me the most is like nearly every hunter for most of the year has to rely on grocery stores still. They're not eating only meat. Like there's very few people that actually adhere to a carnivore diet. Most people are still going to the store to buy foods like grains and lentils and or legumes and other caloric dense and even like other non-caloric dense foods that are grown in agriculture. So there's no like really.
I mean, even if they weren't, right, even if they were somehow, they had everything set up perfectly, completely off the grid, completely self-sufficient, never have to visit any store, They're gonna get invited out for dinner one time, to a friend's birthday party, to a wedding, to some sort of event where they're gonna have no control over the catering or a million other things. I mean, even just in the example the last guest gave, going and staying somewhere else to do a bit of hunting. Right. Well, you're not in control anymore. You rely on what is around you. So you may well be able to do this to the full extent, giving you that benefit of the doubt at home. But as soon as you leave your house or go anywhere or drive anywhere, they go to the gas station, all these things, you're still contributing.
Yep, absolutely.
Because they're not, I mean, you could go to the extremes of like, they make their own bow and arrow, right? So they never have to visit a gun shop or any of these things, but they are still going to go somewhere some point. And if they're not, then yeah, they're the one unique example that has no interaction, but they're still violating the rights of whomever they kill every time they take their life.
Even if they're the one unique example, if everybody decided to make that the rule and became that unique example, it would be just as devastating to the ecosystem, and we'd end up reverting right back to factory farming once everybody went extinct.
Yeah, completely, very, very quickly, yeah.
All right, I've got some guests in the queue, so I'm going to bring up
Claw on Cognition. He's been waiting a little while.
Yeah, just bring them up and we'll stop talking.
Oh.
Hey, what's up, Claw?
So, this is actually a pretty good discussion to have. I would say we agree on a lot of things. I do have some points because I'm very, very invested in coyotes and just canids generally. There are some points that were said that I don't really think were grounded, and others that are actually true. One of the ones that I want to say off the bat is when people say that we need to get rid of coyotes, that coyotes don't do anything, coyotes destroy deers, or coyotes are bad. No, that's not true. Coyotes do need to be here. Predators are good to have around, regardless of how a hunter feels about them. They're definitely, I'll get into why I do believe predator management is somewhat warranted in some degree, but having predators on the landscape is 100% needed. Because if you don't, you have a lot of issues with prey population densities. You have a lot of issues with disease flow. Coyotes in particular as selective predators, which what you were mentioning earlier with, say, predators taking out weaker or diseased individuals, that's good. You want predators that are more likely to kind of reduce that disease spread. It also is good at helping to limit the carrying capacity of the deer population by influencing fawn survival rates. So all that was said prior was true there. One thing I'll immediately address is the hunting thing for coyotes. If you kill coyotes, you can't stop the population. That's somewhat true, but those studies kind of need to be told in a better context, because what they often infer is that hunting coyotes produces more coyotes, which is not true. The main thing that comes onto that study is that people assume that when you pressure coyotes, that initiates some kind of biological response to where they'll start breeding in higher numbers and they'll start breeding randomly, which biologically for coyotes is impossible. Coyotes are what we call a seasonally monoestrous animal, so they're not really able to do that.
It's more about
Is that the rebound effect?
Well, the rebound effect is not necessarily so a lot of people equate that to the pressure results in this kind of impulse that coyotes will start breeding based on the pressure that is being put onto them by competition, which we don't really see within any natural ecosystem. We don't see that with wolves. We don't see that with really any other species. And we don't see that with people. They do, well, the easiest dynamic I tend to explain this kind of phenomenon is, say you have 3 breeding pairs of coyotes in an area. Coyotes are very territorial during the breeding season. And the biggest thing that facilitates coyote survival rate is food availability. So when pups are being raised, the breeding pairs are going to be competing with each other, trying to get their offspring as much food as possible. If you kill 2 of those other breeding pairs in that area, there's now more resources for the remaining breeding pair to provide their offspring. That drastically increases their survival rate. So if you see an influx of coyotes after, say, someone's just shot a bunch, that's not because they're breeding randomly. They breed at certain times of year as they're seasonally monoestrous. And then as well, most of the time, it's not even the pups that are filling in that vacancy. That's often just natural dispersal rates of coyotes. So unknown transient coyotes that are wandering into areas, finding available spots that can supply a coyote. And that also depends on the availability of the environment. Coyotes are really adaptable, but not all environments are going to be really attractive to a coyote. Maybe there's a lot more human influence, a lot more human pressure. That can be somewhat of a dissuader from coyotes establishing themselves quickly after pressure. maybe there's a lot of food availability. So environmental pressure often dictates how quickly coyotes will fill in a vacancy after human pressure is acquired. But the big thing as well is the reason why I wanted to mention why I do believe some predator management is warranted. Once again, I absolutely believe predators should be here. I love studying coyotes. I mean, I love coyotes. They're one of my favorite animals. So I definitely don't want to see them removed. When people say they're invasive, that's somewhat true and untrue. There are states that dictate their invasive status. It is a little convoluted in some states because here where I live, they naturally congregated. There are different sources that try to call them invasive where I live, but the actual term that we describe them for in the law is we call them, what was it? I think naturalized. Naturalized is the term. So yeah, they basically just filled in the role because we got rid of the red wolves a long time ago. Coyotes just fill in that same vacancy. Other states though, like I'm pretty sure North Carolina, they didn't naturally migrate to North Carolina. They had been introduced into fox pens and stuff like that for hunting purposes, which, yeah, that's definitely a problem. That happens a lot, and I'm not a very big fan of introducing species to areas for hunting purposes. That causes a lot more issues than it really does for conservation in any way. Even if it's funding, it just often introduces species to the area that have more damage than good for that local ecology. So there's problems.
Could I ask you one thing on that?
So I've actually found evidence to the contrary, because I've had hunters claim that, they're not native and all of this stuff. So I've done lots of research into that. And from my understanding, they've been migrating like up the East Coast for like 40, 50, 60 years. But
yeah, they're still migrating.
Yeah, but you're saying that they were introduced to North Carolina, and that was actually a key point that some hunters were saying. And when I researched that, I couldn't find evidence that a reintroduction on any area actually contributed to these populations more so than the actual migration.
It's probably a facilitation of both. That's why it is quite convoluted, because people claim that they're invasive. And while some states designate them as such, at this point, they should just be considered a naturalized animal in most of the range they occupy, because they're basically just filling in a vacancy. That's all they're really doing. That's just natural process.
I'd like to maybe the point of contention that we might have. You mentioned predator control. So in your view, it sounds like you're well educated, and I'd love to hear more. Like, it sounds like you know about coyotes. Like, in this, I really appreciate you coming up and talking to us about it. But like, why do you think that predators need control mechanisms outside of the natural mechanisms that are in nature? Of carrying capacity, competition, migration, disease, parasites, like all of these things. Why do you think there needs to be human involvement in predator population control?
It's definitely a very interesting thing, but the main reason is mostly due to what we have with particularly mesopredators. It's not as much of a problem with, say, macropredators like gray wolves. Gray wolves, they are really controversial, but in reality for gray wolves, you don't really need to manage a gray wolf population because they're entirely just set on, they're fairly well self-preserving. They are very intraspecifically aggressive. They kill each other a lot. They get killed by their prey. They're really tied into their prey population. So there's not really a need to manage, say, bigger macro predators to prevent overpopulation. And I'm not going to say coyotes are extensively overpopulated, but we do have systems where we have what we call population imbalances based on prey supply and predator population. Examples of this are in places like North Carolina. North Carolina particularly has had issues with the amount of mesopredators. The eastern U.S. in general typically has a bigger issue with a surplus of mesopredators. A mesopredator could really classify as anything from a bobcat, a coyote, a raccoon, an opossum, primarily due to the impacts of, and this is not just them, I'm not saying that this is entirely their fault. This is just as an influx of human development, environmental conditions, and that brings down certain prey populations. But as a result of the prey population declining, normally that prey population would be able to rebound by itself over time, even if it was mostly facilitated by natural things. But because, especially in the eastern U.S., there's so much development and so much human influence in these areas, it does make the recline of those species that are impacted by environmental conditions a lot more tedious. So management of the predators in those areas where prey populations, examples of this is, I believe, in the 1980s, 1970s, there was a significant decline in wild turkey as well as bobwhite quail, and large percentages of that were facilitated by directive predation by mesopredators not only raiding nests, but also just eating the general population. Management of those mesopredators in those key areas did help the populations rebound because it essentially relieved the pressure. And we see that consistently in a couple other areas. Historically, if you want to look at as well, a macro predator example, in the Sierra Nevadas in 1995, after the 1990 petition to remove mountain lion hunting, the bighorn population in the Sierra Nevadas dropped to a historic low at about 100 individuals back in 1995, and about 96% of that attributed drop was directive predation by predators. That was likely facilitated by environmental conditions, bad droughts, winters, all that kind of stuff just impacted the population. And as a result, that made predation of that population a lot easier. And that just caused a very big drop. But about 56% of that attributed drop was contributed to directive mountain lion predation. So Sierra Nevada was really the only particular area where there was lion management being done after the 1990 ban in California, mostly to kind of relieve the pressure by mountain lions for bighorn so that the bighorn population could slowly resurge. And so that's the kind of dynamic that I will agree, why I want predators here. Predator management, in particular to the conservancy of the wildlife, is mostly entwined to what kind of human influences are influencing the population recline of prey populations when environmental conditions impact them. And that's something that we're seeing today. It hasn't really been talked about yet, but there is something very big right now in New Mexico with the pronghorn population. There is a historic drop in the pronghorn population. I believe about 70% of the entire state population has declined, mostly due to the impacts of environmental conditions, but once again being facilitated by predation, particularly around coyotes. I believe about 50-60% of the population drop has been facilitated by coyotes. So
Yeah,
that's
so
mostly it.
yeah, no, I can appreciate all of that, and yeah, I mean, I would love to share some data with you, and vice versa. If you could share some studies, I'm always willing to look at those.
Absolutely.
I guess like my counter argument to the idea that we need to control predator populations through hunting, and like you didn't specify that, so you kind of leave it open to like maybe there are other options than just hunting. I would argue that there are more humane options than ending the life of these animals. And since you care about coyotes so much, I would hope that you would also see that there are
100%.
like contraceptives, birth control type options,
I wish
relocation.
that was invested in more, honestly. Contraceptive work. So there's been a couple great places that have studied that, and it's actually been really good for it. North Carolina in particular, it keeps going back there, but they've got a lot of research on coyotes there. They actually tend to find that sterilized coyote populations, not only do they they can't breed because they're sterilized, so the population isn't increasing, but as well, if you leave them sterilized, you don't neuter them, you don't spay them, they're sterilized, they still have their reproductive drive. So they form breeding pairs and they stay in their general areas, but the population isn't increasing. It is something that, why hunting in regards, it can be useful. Hunting generally should never be the only thing that is done to kind of help relieve pressure or help to manage a population. And when people say that for deer or other animals, they're being entirely disingenuous. Because while hunting can be used to help, say, manage deer populations, it's definitely not the only thing. The biggest places where we're having, like, because you mentioned deer car crashes and stuff like that, the biggest places where deer car crashes are happening is primarily in urban areas. And that's because the deer population has generally increased because of urban areas. And that sounds like weird to say, but the major thing about that is, for one, there's less predator competition there. There's just generally less predators that predate on deer in those areas, but there's also more food. There's lawns, there's gardens, there's places that don't really experience heavy droughts or heavy food declines. So the deer population can sustain itself much better in urban areas than it can in most of their natural habitats. So that's why we have so many deer crashes, say, in a lot of these urban places, because there's just so many deer, because now there's farms, there's grass, there's lawns everywhere that doesn't dry up. And as a result, they use contraceptives a lot of the time, because legally, it's not morally okay to like manage deer in an area where there's a high concentration of people, because it's a very big safety concern. But as well, it just wouldn't really be effective. So they tend to use contraceptive work on deer in those areas.
Yeah, and I think those types of, mitigations for population control are a lot more accepted in the general population, because the trends we see are more people wanting less violent solutions, and not supporting the culling of predators or not supporting things like trophy hunting. I think even within the hunting community, we can see in comments and in discussions with hunters that most hunters don't like the idea of trophy hunting. So I think there's a lot of kind of social sentiment towards nonviolent methods of controlling, animals. And I think when we just look at violent solutions like hunting, we're doing an extreme service not only to the ecosystem, and not only to our morals, but also to those individuals, right? And if we care about like coyotes and their individual role in the ecosystem, within their family unit, and again, within the wider ecosystem, then we need to consider those individuals and their right to exist, right? Like they didn't choose to be there. They're not coming here with the intention of, taking out all of our livestock or something like that. So I think having that consideration where we empathize and we have compassion for these animals who didn't choose to be here and have just as much, if not more, of a right to be on these lands than we do. I think that's an important perspective to have, and I really appreciate you approaching this in such a factual and like ecological perspective. So I really commend you on that.
Thank you. And the biggest thing is it's hard for me to listen sometimes in the comments because I listen to hunters, and I'm a hunter myself, but I'm a very nuanced person when it comes to the way the ecosystem works. And if there is a solution that requires like, oh, if we want to manage a population and a result is hunting is not the practical sense, and it is much better to use, say, contraceptives, or it's much better to even just leave the population and let it rely on the natural carrying capacity, which in a lot of places, that's really all that really needs to be done. In places where there's a more well-preserved ecosystem, where population imbalances are less in toad, that's something that's going to be very big to look into. So it should definitely just be left alone to where let the ecosystem manage itself at that point. You don't need to manage extensive predators if the populations are going to be relatively maintained to the carrying capacity of their ecosystem. With mesopredators, that kind of gets a little skewed because not only is there just higher food availability in human areas where mesopredators, and that was a point that I wanted to address earlier as well, that at least coyotes and other things are not as drawn to people, which that's not necessarily true. I don't know if that was the exact point that was made, but coyotes actually do really well in human environments. They actually tend to do better in more human-like environments than they do in a lot of their natural habitats. And that's because there's just higher prey availability. That's generally why coyotes were able to expand their range so quickly. A lot of people attribute that to the eradication of, say, gray wolves, which removing red wolves and gray wolves definitely did help speed up their expansion, but it's more likely that the creation of what we call idealized habitat was what really facilitated the coyotes' expansion to the east and into Central and South America. Because as of right now, coyotes are moving down into South America because there's just more connective human habitat that provides better prey availability, domestic pets, farm animals, and small animals that they naturally eat. So there's just more in that general area. And as a result, the population of those animals is able to sustain their young. There's more prey availability, so that increases the increase of, say, pup survival rate, and as well for, say, raccoons and opossums. So those are general reasons why we try to manage mesopredators, because there is, especially here in the eastern United States, there's just more human influence. And as a result, those animals do really well in these habitats. Other animals don't do as well, like, say, the wild turkey, the bobwhite quail. I mean, the list could go on for species that don't do well in human environments.
And I think that's why a lot of us in the vegan community advocate for rewilding projects, and having these larger, connective systems of, natural land, and we can do that through a switch to a plant-based food system. We could rewild up to 70 to 80% of our farmland if we did, as a society, decide to shift towards more plant-based options for food. And that would allow us to rewild areas. We could have incentive programs for some of these ranchers to rewild their pastures, reforestation projects, or keeping more native managed pasture for a lot of these animals. And I think a lot of those problems that we face through human disturbance and through human land management change could be addressed through that. So I appreciate you coming up and educating us. I might give you a follow or at least hit you up and ask for some
Yes.
of your sources.
Well, thank you
I
for letting me come
do.
up and just kind of
Yeah,
discuss that because
yeah,
I definitely want to throw that out there just because I
yeah,
hear stuff about coyotes or predators and I'm like, I have to say something every now and again. If
yeah.
I could say
Well,
one more thing to the ranching part, because that actually is something that is a big problem where I live. I live in Florida, and I know people are gonna like, oh, Florida. So, but I care a lot about wildlife conservation here. The big thing is here in Florida, one of the biggest concerns, and while obviously it's different across the place, I know like say in the western U.S. or in the mid U.S. there's going to be a lot more damage and influence from say farming, but here in the United and this state at the very least, ranching and farmland has actually been it's fairly rewilded. There's some ranches and farms that are not very good for wildlife, but what we have is currently called the Florida Wildlife Corridor. And that uses private lands, mostly ranch land, because a lot of the ranch land is cattle land here. Florida's a really big agriculture state, if people don't know that. And as a result, the connective habitat connects to public land and conserved refuge land. And as a result, that is the Florida connection for the Florida Panther. The biggest thing for the Florida Panther, which is only about 230 Florida Panthers left, and the biggest thing that threatens them is just general habitat loss because of urban development. There's just so many people coming here trying to move into the state. There's just so much development going on that there's a lot of habitat fragmentation, and as a result, that ends up killing panthers because they try to cross the road. Reward mortality is huge for panthers, and that has severely impacted population and genetic diversity. But I'm not saying I'm not definitely like trying to advocate for ranching or farming. That's not my expertise. I can't say too much on there, so I don't attempt to if I can't say it proficiently. But at the very least, I do know that good rewilded like habitat land, especially agricultural land, whether it's plant based or even just say meat based agriculture, as long as it is well managed and it is supporting more rewilding practices, it is very beneficial. So I absolutely do agree with that point that you made that increasing the way we are kind of working around our agriculture to incorporate wildlands is extremely beneficial for preserving native wildlife, especially endangered wildlife.
cool.
All
I
right. Well,
appreciate you coming
thank you all
again.
for letting me up.
Yeah. Sarah was calling you out. Yeah,
Well,
Sarah.
yeah, and I
Mentioned,
was just going to quickly say as well, it doesn't really make sense to me that you could oppose the hunting of coyotes, especially as kind of like passionately as that, but also perpetuate the very thing that causes them to be hunted. So if
yeah,
you see animals as objects, even if you're not going to the store and you're only hunting, then obviously other people can't do that hunting. So they'll go to Walmart, for example, and buy their factory farmed animals. And it's the factory farms and animal agriculture which are hunting and running the coyotes away because they're a threat to their industry. So
yeah.
you're part of the very cycle that you oppose. And that makes no sense to me whatsoever.
Yeah. I think a lot of times, I see within the hunting community, and I understand it, because I grew up in the hunting community for 26, 27 years of my life. I was a hunter, and I was raised in a hunting family. So I understand how you can have that like connection with wildlife and love a species, but then still go out and have that cognitive dissonance and that conditioning to like say like, well, this one individual doesn't make that much of an impact. And like overcoming that is very difficult when you've been conditioned to see these animals as resources like the North American model perpetuates. And I really hope that he kind of starts to introspect a little bit more on that, and will kind of understand or maybe come to a deeper understanding of the inherent worth of these animals, outside of just like some function in an ecosystem. Like they as individuals matter to their family and to themselves. They have inherent like value, that I think a lot of hunters are kind of conditioned to overlook. And that was a struggle I had to overcome. And it's not easy, like I understand, but having that much passion for like a specific species is awesome. But I also would like very much encourage him to like look into like, why do you care so much, right? Like what is their inherent value? Like surely they have a right to exist, just as much as we do, and free from harm. So yeah, but let's see if we can get another guest here. We got quite a few in the queue. Let's see, we got a few more gifters. I'll pull up here. A Hall 33. I know you've been here for a while. See if you load up. Hey,
Yes,
how's it
sir.
going?
How you doing?
Pretty good. How about you?
Same.
Good. So what's your thoughts on the subject here?
I'm not here to hate. I promise you that. But can
Uh-oh.
you give me 30 seconds?
That sounds like a hard start. But
Hey,
yes, you
hey,
got the floor.
it's a hard start, yes. But please give me 30 seconds to explain my
All right.
background here.
Countdown starts now.
Okay, cool. So I'm from Iowa. So we have a different living standard than what some of y'all do. I know we're all from different areas. Everything's different.
15 seconds. I'm just messing with you. But you're solid. What's up? What's your point? Like, let's get to the
No,
point.
you're good. You're good, buddy. I'm not here to fight. I'm halfway on your side. I don't hunt, but I love to shoot.
Okay.
Can you distinguish for me what the difference between those two things is?
Hunting
I
and
like to
shooting. I'm
shoot,
not
and I
killing
don't shoot
a
at
live
anybody that's
being.
alive.
Period.
Sorry. Let's let him clarify here. So yeah. So when you say shooting, do you mean like going to a range, or you have a range in your yard where you just like to shoot weapons, or do you mean like shooting at living creatures?
Your first two options there. Yes, sir.
Okay. So
I do
shooting on a
not like to
range.
kill. I do not like to kill. I'm not.
Okay.
I don't. I don't
Okay.
shoot at living beings.
Cool. Yeah. Good. Okay. So what's your contention with the subject here, or with like a disagreement with hunting as a means of population control?
My disagreement was 45 minutes ago, and I've just been hanging out in this live since then.
Cool.
I've got some knowledge since then, and I don't disagree with anything that you guys are saying so much, but
Okay.
it's all relative to the area that you're in. Because in
Okay.
Iowa, we do have the big game hunters that come in, land the food plots, do their thing, and then bounce. And they only come in for deer season, and that's
Do you
it.
think that's a good thing though? Like what do you think that role is that they play benefiting your area as far as like it relates to conservation of land, wildlife, biodiversity?
The only thing they benefit is buying tags, honestly.
Right. And so those tags and that funding goes towards land management practices at a state level to increase the population of those animals that they're hunting typically. Sometimes there can be broader benefits to some of those land management practices, but historically, and what we see currently is that there are actually negative impacts to biodiversity by focusing funding on these land management practices that prioritize certain species over others. So I would argue that hunting actually does a disservice to conservation in that way, because hunters are wanting to go and they're wanting to exploit wildlife, right? Like they want to go out and they want to get that elk, they want to get that big deer, they want to fill their fridge, right? That's extraction of natural resources, right? Considering living animals as resources, and that's doing a disservice to the ecosystem, right? And not to mention those what land management practices are happening to kind of keep that population at a level where hunters can continue to exploit that system. So in that sense, like I think that hunting is very much in contradiction to conservation practices.
I'll tell you, the majority of the hunters in the state of Iowa that are not outside of Iowa, they're just hunting to put meat in their freezer. They're not wanting that big game. They'll shoot a button buck
Yeah,
and not
but
give a damn about it, just to have meat in the freezer.
it's inconsequential though, like right to my argument. Like it doesn't matter if they're going out and getting the best or the worst. They're still exploiting our ecosystems, right? And like right now, we're in a biodiversity crisis. We've had something like 3 million different birds disappear from North America alone just in the last like 30 years. And that is a failure of our conservation strategies, right? And our conservation strategies currently are heavily focused on these game species when we talk about hunting and conservation. So I think, like trying to argue that, oh, well, they're doing some kind of ecosystem service is actually like not true at all. A lot of these hunting practices are actually detrimental to our ecosystem. So, trying to argue that they're maybe not taking the best buck or they're taking, the best buck, it's inconsequential to the argument, that I'm making as hunting is not conservation.
Can I ask you where you're from? I think I gathered that you're from North Carolina.
I'm from South Carolina, but yeah, close to
Okay.
South Carolina.
Okay.
But I grew up hunting. I was a hunter for 26 years, mostly small game, but I did deer hunt as well. I grew up on timber property, so we had hundreds and thousands of acres of friends' land as well that we would hunt on, and we did land management practices specifically for increasing deer, turkey, quail, ducks, like all of these species that we wanted to exploit in the wild. So I'm very familiar with land management practices. I'm very familiar with hunting. And I'm very familiar now with a lot of these arguments for why hunters think, that they're participating in conservation, which I think is just like very fallacious and incorrect.
That was not a dig. And
No
you have done far more hunting than I have, because I did some rabbit hunting and then some coyote hunting, and I couldn't fucking pull the trigger because it looked like a dog. So,
yeah. Well, I mean that's just
I'm not a hunter. I'm not a hunter. I'm a shooter.
Well, you recognize that empathy and that value that the animal has, and that was the same situation for me. Like I grew up hunting. Even after I went vegan, I was still like considering that there was some service that hunting could play in conservation. But the more I studied it, the more I was like, no, like actually it's the opposite. Hunting actually has negative impacts on all of these things that hunters say they're helping with conservation. And then the big click for me, kind of like with the coyote and the dog for you maybe, was that I recognized that this bunny that I was hanging out with, my wife's domestic bunny that she had adopted, it had its own personality. It had friends. It was friends with the dog, like it would come up and recognize me and like say hey to me. And I was like, well, I used to hunt rabbit. And I didn't think about any of that. I didn't think about the rabbit's family. I didn't think about its individuality. I didn't care about that. All I cared about was putting that meat in the freezer, right? And you recognize that in the coyote, that it's like you don't want to take that life because you recognize, you can empathize with that animal. And it's just like your dog, there's no moral difference, in that. And that's kind of the core of, what I'm trying to kind of debate here is like, our view and objectification of animals and of wildlife and is viewing them as wild resources does a disservice not only to the ecosystem, because there are detriments like I've explained to the ecosystem, but also to those individual animals that we are unaliving and exploiting, for our taste pleasure or for fill in the freezer, or for all of these unjustifiable and unnecessary reasons. So, I would very much encourage you, like if you haven't already, like look into plant-based diets. There's a lot of misinformation out there, to encourage people to stay on meat-heavy diets or to continue consuming animal products. But there's huge benefits to plant-based diets. Even if you don't fully connect with the ethics, like a lot of people maybe struggle to empathize with a cow or a chicken. But I would also encourage you to go to an animal sanctuary, meet some of these animals, and say hey to a cow, and learn that cow's name and learn its, like about its life. And you will see these animals differently. And all of a sudden, it's just so much easier, to consume a plant-based diet and thrive, and you feel mentally better, you feel physically better. You're less likely to have a lot of the leading causes of death, like heart disease, atherosclerosis, cancers, obesity. There's so many benefits to being compassionate, and it's just like karmic almost, like I don't fully believe in karma, but if there is karma, a perfect example of it is the consumption of animals versus a plant-based diet, and choosing compassion, like you did for not pulling that trigger on the coyote, can lead to so many benefits in your own life, and also kind of like a wave effect of compassion into others. It's not easy being a vegan in a non-vegan society. Everybody, all of my family, is still hunting. They haven't changed anything in their life. But me, by standing up and choosing, to speak out for animals and to do these research and debates with people, I think really sparks in people that idea of like, it's possible. There are other options than being violent towards wildlife. So I really appreciate you coming up and having this chat. I hope you'll give me a follow and follow along. Like I've got a lot of different content about hunting, and conservation and stuff like that, and a lot of cute animal stuff as well. But yeah, I really appreciate you coming up, man.
I appreciate all that. I really do, because I really did try the vegan diet. It didn't work for me.
So check out challenge22.com. It's a free resource for nutritionists, and they will help you get on a plant-based diet. The idea is that it takes 22 days to enact like lasting change. And these diets
I tried that. My wife
cool.
decided she wanted to try to divorce me in that area.
No.
I was not right. My brain fog was crazy.
Yeah. So you did challenge 22, you said?
I didn't do challenge 22, but I did the vegan based diet for.
Yeah. I mean, when you take out the
month and a half.
animal from your diet, you have to replace those nutrients with something. So oftentimes people will like try to make that switch without having the understanding of nutrition, or having a dietitian's input. So it can really help, making that switch. One really easy thing is just making those substitutions, like for mock meats. A lot of people get worried about the processing, but the processing in most of the meats, and dairy products is equivalent to what happens, with a lot of these vegan mock meats. So that's a really good, easy to replace it. You can also just replace a lot of the meat with beans and rice, or a combination of certain whole plant foods. So there's a variety of ways. And I mean, if you ever need help on that, we've got a really great community here. Some people with nutrition backgrounds. So if you ever have questions, we're more than happy to help you out to make that, compassionate and thoughtful choice.
And that's the thing. I'm in an area where we produce half the fucking. I wouldn't say half, but half of
a lot.
The U.S. is red meat.
Yeah,
like it's abundant here, so it's super hard to find a more expensive alternative to red meat.
Ozark, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, when I was in Arizona, I lived on a subdivided cattle ranch with the nearest store within like an hour and a half of me, and there was still I still was able to go get adequate protein that I needed to replace the nutrients that I did get. But I wanted to address the challenge22.com thing really quick a little bit more, because if it's something that you are truly interested, I don't remember if Ben mentioned that it's a free 22-day program, but there's a registered dietitian that will help you specifically tailor a plant-based diet to your lifestyle and your needs. So it's always worth checking into. And it's like a no obligation thing too. Like you can sign up for it, and then, they'll give you a date when you're ready to start, and you can start. But if you fall off, you can always start it again.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Ozark, but I've been on red meat and potato diet since birth. So,
well, yeah, I mean, like most of us that have become vegan, we were the same way. Like Ben was a hunter. I grew up eating a ton of meat myself.
I am not a hunter.
Well, I know. I'm saying we grew up eating meat ourselves. Like I became a vegan when I was 32 years old. That's like halfway through, or like what I perceive as like halfway through my life. Hopefully a little under half, but you know what I'm saying? Like into my middle age. I mean, that was the case for most of us. So the change is possible. And even though so much time has gone on for you, that doesn't mean like you don't have to continue to adhere to it. And if it's something that you are actually like curious about, you can consider at least just checking out the website, and maybe just having it for if you do decide to explore the change a little bit more.
I tried. I really did, but I was running a half pace when I was on a vegan diet.
Well, that's why I was expressing that they have a registered dietitian that helps you specifically tailor the diet to your needs and make sure you get all of the stuff you may have been lacking when you tried to do it solo.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and feel free, to reach out to me. I can, talk to some people in our group if you have specific questions. I mean, I think actually Lydia's here in the chat.
Look, I'm not knocking anything you're saying now. I tried it. And
Yeah, I was just going to say, think back to that day when you couldn't pull the trigger.
When I tried it, so
yeah, it's going to say at the moment you're still thinking about like yourself as the victim in this situation, but just think back to that day when you couldn't pull the trigger, and all you're doing at the moment is handing your money over to someone else to pull the trigger for you. It's still happening.
Yeah, sure.
So if you consider that it doesn't have to because of a victim, in exactly the same way that you didn't want to pull the trigger, stop paying for it and make it work. Like, even if you have to speak to someone, put the effort in, it's going to be a bit weird for a while because you've done something completely different for however many years, right? But it'll become normalized, especially if you connect with the why, and you've already connected with the why and shown us that because you couldn't pull the trigger.
Yeah, but even a vegan diet is not victimless.
It is in terms of direct rights violations. Obviously, there's unintentional harm that's caused, but in terms of
it's not unintentional. If you're putting the chemicals down that makes shit not live.
Yeah, so
unintentional.
I mean, I'm a farmer, so I do know that you don't have to use those chemicals. So we can actually
what they do is the problem.
So can I finish my point? Like here,
yes, sir. I apologize.
I do want to address you're trying to appeal to futility and saying even if I go vegan, there's still going to be some crop deaths or you're still going to use pesticides. But the fact is, we can make farming better. There's no way to make killing or unaliving animals to eat their flesh better, right? Even if you treat that cow the best possible and you give it the best life, you're still taking its life unnecessarily when you could be eating beans. You could be eating potatoes, like you mentioned. That's a great one. I live off of potatoes, man. I love potatoes. Yeah. There's so many options that you can pick, and like Andy said, it really comes down to recognizing that connection to the animal that you are having to unalive. And if you can't do it yourself, why should you pay somebody else to do it when you can find other options? And again, it may be difficult. It's not going to be easy to just switch overnight. I mean, like you said, 40 something years you've been living a certain way. And I totally understand. I mean, I did that for 26, 27 years. My mother was a dietitian. So I really thought that I had the understanding of what a good diet was. But then I educated myself. I became, empathetic to these animals, and I understood that it's unnecessary. And not to mention, I can have a longer, better, healthier life by making the compassionate choice, right? So, there's not really a good excuse. I understand that it can be difficult. But a lot of the best things in life, are difficult, and it's worth the input, to make that change for the better. You will sleep better. You're just going to have a better life in general, and you're going to align your actions with your morals. Does that make sense?
It does. And does a bee's life mean less than a cow's life?
Do you guys mind if I just interject really quick, because I think this is going to be part of the answer for you as well. But when we talk about the harm and the victims involved in agriculture in general, there's I know Andy kind of said this, but there's a difference between directly going out of our way to harm an animal because we want to benefit from that animal versus protecting our food source. That would be like me, somebody breaking into my house and me using escalation of force to defend myself, even if it becomes violent, versus me going out and looking for somebody just to hurt because I'll benefit from them somehow. And I just wanted to convey that to you and the audience listening, because a lot of people don't understand the difference, and we are well aware of the harm that does occur in agriculture, but overall, animal consumption contributes to significantly more harm and destruction than plant consumption does, and that takes into account hunting and agriculture, animal agriculture.
And I'm with you on that, but it's all relative to location.
Sure. So I know Ben lives in rural South Carolina. I live in rural Arkansas. I know a lot of people in the comments, and guest earlier was discussing wild hogs and deer issues. And
We don't have wild hogs in Iowa yet.
yeah, well, I mean, I'm just expressing. So I understand like that a lot of these like misconceptions might occur because people have been taught stuff that they need to manage these populations, but it's largely due to a lack of other management that has been attempted. That's usually the first go-to. Well, there's invasive animals. Just go out and start shooting them because we don't want to invest in protection or the fence, or we want to save our livestock, but we don't want to spend the additional time or cost that it might take to protect our fields or whatever the case might be.
I do understand that, but as of Iowa, we do not have any protected wildlife here. So,
But
Sure,
I think
I don't.
you're glazing over Ozark's point here. Like, I mean, he's trying to appeal to your argument, that it's futile to do, so I'm just going to keep eating meat. His rebuttal is that, well, by consuming a plant-based diet rather than an animal-based diet, you're contributing less, to that issue that you're concerned with. So,
except for we're killing far more bees than we are hogs
So do you
in the
think,
States.
is your argument that, like vegans are the only ones like drinking almond milk and like consuming these products?
Not at all. I drink almond milk and I'm not a vegan, but
Yeah. So I mean, like your arguments aren't really making sense here. Like if you care about the individuals, like your question was, does a bee's life matter more than a cow's? Well, if it's unnecessary exploitation, it doesn't matter. Both of their, inherent value is the same. If you don't need to exploit them, you choose another option. You choose the almond milk. You choose the oat milk. You choose the mock meat. You choose the beans and rice rather than
yeah,
the animal.
but my newborn can't drink almond milk. She has to drink milk.
Dairy?
So I'm forced to buy dairy milk.
You can get soy powder, but just very quickly to answer your question directly. So if we go back to 1945, a year after the Vegan Society was formed, Donald Watson, who was one of the
1945.
co-founders.
What are we doing right now?
I'm just answering your question about the bees, but I can answer it kind of like directly, so to speak. So there was a letter in 1945 that was sent, essentially saying, well, what's the problem with vegans consuming honey? Because they're just bees. And Donald Watson's response actually provided us with our very first definition was I can't think what the thing is, but essentially the Vegan Society exists to oppose the oppression and exploitation of all sentient life. So in that definition, bees, cows, humans, dogs, they're all the same. They're sentient life. And so there is no, scale of where we value that. It's if this oppression and exploitation occurs to them, we oppose it.
I'm with you, but the express purpose of all the things that we sacrifice, beef, poultry, pork, is all because of their consumption. Like, they wouldn't be here if they didn't have that express purpose.
So do you think it would be ethical to like breed humans just to work them specifically, and it would be okay because that's what we specifically bred them for, or to consume them? Like,
Are you telling the U.S.? Are you telling me that the U.S. population doesn't already do that?
I'm saying, do you think it would be ethical to directly farm human beings in order to work them or eat them? You think that would be ethical?
I mean, we are farming them for workforce. We're not
What instances are we farming humans? Like, can you tell me where a human farm exists?
The U.S. population for workforce.
I'm talking about a specific farm that like directly breeds humans specifically, like to use them and consume them.
I understand.
How even paying them? Because
Give
what you're
me one-
describing is capitalism and
one-
exploitation, but workers in the United States are getting paid. So that's not really exploitation necessarily.
Yeah, they also
They
do
get
that.
paid slave wages in some
Farming a
sort.
human to use them. Like that's the logic here. Like that's what you're saying. Like we're growing these animals specifically to use them. Like they wouldn't exist if we didn't do that. So like just try to think about this for
They
a
wouldn't,
second.
honestly. They'd be
Yeah, but
extinct.
we could
They
move
shouldn't.
that to something like dog fighting, right? Would you agree then? The dogs are bred into existence purely for the purpose of dog fighting. Therefore, to use your logic, that's okay.
I mean, dogs are bred into existence for pets. Period.
Well, no, there
That's it.
definitely are dogs that are bred for the sole purpose of fighting other dogs, aren't there? And so, using your logic and being consistent, we'd have to say that was also okay. That's what their purpose is. That's what they were bred for. They wouldn't exist if dog fighting didn't exist.
Yeah, let me.
I'm
let me
having a
rephrase this
hold
little
on,
bit better for you.
hold on. I'm having a slightly hard time trying to figure out what you're saying. Are you saying
That's what I was
dog
gonna say.
fighting?
Let me rephrase it better.
Not you, Ozark. I'm talking about the other guy.
Yeah. I mean, I can give you a perfect example.
Are you talking
my
about
dog
dog fighting?
from a dog fighting ring? He was bred by people for the purpose of fighting other dogs. And so, using your logic, because that's what he was bred for, I should have left him there.
But there's a minute population of the U.S. that is dog fighting.
It's irrelevant. It's the same logic. It's what he was bred for.
It's not irrelevant.
It's your logic of that's what they exist for. If dog fighting didn't exist, my dog would never have been bred.
Okay, so my German Shepherd here just was for the express purpose of dog fighting.
No, I don't think you're understanding. what
That's
I'm
not
saying.
what I'm saying, but
You're
it's
not
your
understanding
logic that I'm
this.
just testing, and obviously you're not consistent with it
So-
because you don't want to agree here.
It's not that I'm not consistent. It's that I
Let
don't
me
understand.
just give me a chance here, all right? Just give me a chance, all right? So let's say I build a farm right now, right? I build a farm, and the purpose is specifically to breed dogs for fighting. I'm not saying everybody in the U.S. is doing that.
Then
I'm
you're an
saying-
asshole, and you should be
So-
bankrupt.
Okay, so thank you. That's exactly what I'm trying to express here, right? So what you just described about me and how you feel about me, that's exactly what most people are doing when they're consuming animals, because animal consumption is unnecessary. We don't need to do it. We grow enough food without the animals that we produce. and
No,
most of the
sir.
crops that we grow to
do
fuel
not
them. Yes,
grow
sir.
enough food
That
without.
is okay, how many edible crops in the United States are fed to livestock?
A good
We're
majority.
near 80% of the edible crops in the
I'm
United
from Iowa,
States.
and I'm pretty sure the last time I looked, it's 40% of Iowa crops go to.
I'm talking about the United
consumption-
States. Upwards near 80% of edible crops in the United States are dedicated to livestock. That's crops that humans could eat.
Hey, I'm not going to talk outside of my knowledge. I
Well,
only
that's what I'm
know
trying to express.
Iowa knowledge.
You're telling me I'm wrong. I have a very small farm here. Right? I know Ben does. I read these statistics on a daily basis.
I didn't tell you you're wrong.
You did when I
Guys,
explained that.
I appreciate this conversation, but we've definitely gotten really far from the topic. So, Hall, I think we really covered a lot in this conversation. And I really appreciate your time up here.
I want to
and-
say, I was only coming from the Iowa aspect. So
Well, yeah, and I hope
I
you've
appreciate
learned
the
a few
conversation.
things here. I hope you've learned a few things, and I hope we'll see you again here, and maybe in some of our friends' lives to discuss the ethics a little bit more of plant-based diets. We do also farming-related topics as well. So myself and Andy, Not Your Mom, Not Your Milk down here, also does, some farming topics. Ozark and I do farming topics sometimes too. So we'd be happy to get into those some other time. But I do want to move on to the next guest to try to stay on topic. But I
You're
really
good.
do
You're
appreciate
good.
you
You're
coming up.
good. You don't have to explain.
Cool.
I only wanted to get in the meat processing aspects of the conversation, but we never got there. So,
Okay, maybe next time. We'll see you.
so yeah, appreciate it.
Yep.
Sorry for
All right.
taking it off topic.
No, it's all good. We kind of spun out there.
Hey
Yeah.
guys.
Hey, what's up? How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. I'm over here in Northwest Florida, J Florida to be exact. And I know you said it multiple times, but could you reinstate what you mean by hunting is not a part of conservation?
Yeah, so I'm actually say hunting is not conservation. I do understand that some people think it's a tool of conservation, but even just semantically, so by definition, hunting is the exploitation of wildlife. Conservation is the protection or conserving of wild resources. So hunting is in contradiction to conservation, just at a fundamental level. We could also look at the biodiversity impacts of hunting and the focus on game species like turkey, dove, quail, deer, elk. By focusing a lot of our funding and land management on these species in particular, we overlook a lot of the other animals that should be covered under conservation, as well as a lot of the other parts of conservation like land, water, soil conservation, things like this. So just by definition, I don't think that hunting could be considered conservation.
Okay. And I see your point in that. And I believe you touched on this a little bit earlier with, what was his name? Ahal?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. But whenever this is for every single individual, and this may just be for Florida, I don't know, but anything and everything as far as equipment goes, whenever you purchase, a fraction of that tax that you pay, it's an extra tax. So that's hunting licenses, that's ammunition, that is your pew-pews. That all goes for the conservation of these environments that our animals are living in. And
So
yeah,
I could definitely speak to that. I've actually made some videos on this topic specifically. So what you're referring to is called the Pittman-Robertson Act. It's 11% tax on those things that you mentioned exactly. But that is a small part of the overall conservation funding in the United States. So I believe it was in 2022 or 23, the Pittman-Robertson Act specifically brought in just under or just around $1 billion, which is definitely a considerable amount. But when we look at other conservation funding, like through the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the USDA, which also does do programs like EQIP, which focuses on wildlife. They also focus on soil conservation for farming and other, environmental practices. Even just the USDA allotment for conservation was $8 billion. So just looking at the USDA conservation funding, it was 8 times what the Pittman-Robertson Act was. So when we actually look into it, there are studies that look at the funding for conservation, and most of the studies show that less than 10% of the overall conservation publicly that happens in the United States is funded by hunters. So, I definitely understand why a lot of hunters think that, because the tags, the Pittman-Robertson Act taxation do go to conservation. But a lot of times what those are funding is actually state management for more hunting. And what I mean by that is land management practices, like creating food plots, clearing land, reintroduction or monitoring and regulations around hunting. So to argue that hunting is funding conservation, I think is also a little factually not correct. Because it's actually funding more hunting essentially, which as I mentioned, hunting is the opposite of conservation.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention really quick too, and it's something that's not really acknowledged a lot, but state conservation often butts heads with federal conservation because state-funded conservation is generally oriented around the hunter, whereas federal conservation is oriented around the actual ecosystems.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, I am a simple person. I'm a normal person you would see on the street. And whenever I go out and I'm hunting, I'm not just looking for deer or turkeys or dove, quail, whatever the species that I'm looking for, out there. Anywho, I'm looking at the ground. I'm looking to see if there's other people around me. And in the hunting community, we hold each other accountable. If we see poachers, you're going to get the FW call. FWC is going to be on you. I'm going to give you a full description. So we hold each other
Can I ask
accountable.
genuinely?
So,
'Cause I've never been hunting in my life, but like, what do you see so wrong about poaching that you see differently about what you do?
well, poaching, let's just say I'm out and dove hunting. Well, at that point in time, does have young fawns. So, and with a poacher, yeah, they could go either trying to get freezer meat or they're just trying to score a big buck. But at that point in time, that is not when it is, let's say, the most appropriate time for that because there's babies around. It's not part of their natural. Hold on, am I lagging?
No, you're
Oh,
good.
okay. You were just staring. You were zoning in.
Sorry, I'm reading something
Okay.
up here. I'm listening though.
Yeah, but it's just not the appropriate time for that meat to be harvested.
Right, I hear that, but obviously, from the victim's point of view, they don't care whether you are doing it at the right time in your view or not. Like, they don't want to be murdered, regardless whether you call yourself a hunter or whether you're referred to as a poacher. The problem for them is that they die. I mean, we could look at this in like a human perspective, right? Imagine that I took like a shot with a sniper rifle, and some people say, I'm a hero, and other people say, he's a villain. Well, from the person that I took the life of, that part of it is irrelevant. They've lost their life. It doesn't matter whether I'm a hero or a villain. I'm the person that unalived them.
So is that the same for coyotes, panthers, alligators? Is it for
Yeah,
the same
it'd be
for
the
them?
same for
Because we're all a
anyone
part
whose
of the
life
animal
is being
kingdom.
taken. Yeah, that's what I was trying to ascertain what the difference was. So obviously, it's just the timing. Then it's not the fact that they're taking a life; it's just the fact that it's not convenient.
No, it's not. It's not good for the animal population.
Well, neither is what you're doing. Obviously, you're unaliving them just at a different time that's more convenient for you.
How
Yeah,
could it be more convenient for me whenever I'm not the one reproducing and I'm not the
humans
one
are
having to feed a foal or a fawn?
humans are detrimental to all other wildlife population. I don't think that that's an excuse to go hunt humans.
I'm not sure I'm following.
Well, you were expressing that certain hunting practices are detrimental to the society versus not, right? So I'm just trying to express when we look at the ethics of hunting, humans as a whole, we like our presence, our existence, our actions are always 100% of the time detrimental to wildlife population. And when we hunt them, we exacerbate that, right? But if we didn't hunt them and we hunted humans, we would have a less impact on other wildlife population. But that doesn't give us an excuse to hunt humans.
Well, no, that would be called cannibalism.
Yeah, I know cannibalism's common in nature and it has been in the human race for up until fairly recently. I think that's kind of irrelevant to the discussion, though.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the crux of the issue for us, and kind of getting to what Andy, or not your mom, not your milk down here was trying to get at, is there's no moral difference between a poacher taking a life and you taking a life, right? There's a legal difference, right? And maybe a practice difference. So there's a perceived difference in that action, but to the victim, that animal, there is no difference, right? To the animal, they're losing their life. You're taking them from the ecosystem. So either way, that is a a problem, right, for that victim. So we're kind of looking at the individuals, and their right to exist. Whereas perhaps you're looking at legality or culture, or what you can exploit or use them for. And I mean, I don't know how long you've been in the lab. I think you've been here a while. But like my background was in hunting. So I totally understand, the conditioning that we receive to, treat a coyote differently than a dog. But morally, the way we exploit them or their right to exist is completely the same, right? Like a coyote has no more right to exist out in the pasture than my neighbor's dog. So I'm not going to go unalive the coyote just in the same way I'm not going to go unalive the neighbor's dog. So I think maybe that helps with our perspective a little bit. But yeah, if you want to get back to conservation as the topic, it seems like maybe you're focused around population control. Would you say that is the primary reason you think hunting is part of conservation?
More along the lines like over here we have Blackwater National Forest, and that's over 700,000 acres. It's beautiful, but if you don't go and intervene with controlled burns, not only could you possibly get invasive species, because we have lots of birds that come in, and talking about plant life that can impose diseases for our animals, but also the quality of the native plants that are supposed to be there. So whenever we do controlled burns, that carbon is brought back into the soil so the next generation of plants can come up healthier, stronger, they're able to adapt and accommodate to the change. So that renews the food source for the animals, and plus the deer absolutely love it.
Yeah.
So it balances it. Basically, it balances our native life that we have here.
So I grew up on a tree farm. My family owns quite a bit of land that is devoted to growing pine trees. So I'm very familiar with the acts of control burns and the benefits, but I don't
Mm-hmm.
see really how that relates to hunting as part of conservation. What you're talking about is a land management practice, and I would like to clarify too, like. You mentioned like carbon is returned to the soil. Actually, in a controlled burn, a lot of the carbon actually goes up into the atmosphere. And you actually do lose a lot of nutrients. You do retain like phosphorus and potassium in the ground, but a lot of the carbon is actually released in the form of CO2, as well as some other kind of not great things for breathing and the environment. But I do agree, like controlled burns are an important part of managing some ecosystems. But yeah, I don't think that really relates to like hunting per se. I get your argument that like controlled burns can help with deer, like it does clear out the understory to make new browse available and stuff like that. But as far as like hunting, the act of like going out and unaliving an animal, that to me is just not something that correlates with conservation directly.
Well, I gotta disagree with you on that, because hunting isn't just about going and harvesting meat. It's way more than that. It's visual. It's a whole lot more. It's not just
It's like a connection
unaliving an
with nature.
animal.
Like you would argue, it's like a connection with nature, getting you outside, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So
Absolutely.
wouldn't you also agree that I could go outside for a walk without a weapon, and have that same enjoyment? I could go out. I picked up foraging. So after I stopped hunting, I really got into mushroom and plant foraging. So I have that same connection without the violence of taking a life. And you actually work in symbiosis. You get a lot more connected to the land. I do realize that some hunters get really involved and, they track their game and they go through game trails. But at the end, they're taking the life of an animal that didn't want to die, and that had just as much of a right to be out in that wilderness as any other animal or any human. So, in my perspective, it's immoral to do that and to try to say that that's part of conservation, or that our enjoyment in nature somehow justifies the unaliving of an animal, when there are alternatives, that we can do that are nonviolent, that don't rely on the exploitation of animals.
Yeah, I mean, literally, you could do everything that you normally would do, right? But instead of a rifle, take a camera.
Yeah.
And so you could sit in a blind for hours and hours and hours waiting for that perfect opportunity to take a photograph that you could then sell, for example. So there's still money to be made. You're still out with nature. You're still enjoying everything. But the only thing you're doing is taking a photograph rather than a life.
Yep.
Yeah, I understand where y'all are coming from, but I don't agree with it.
That's
And
okay.
there's nothing wrong with, people wanting to forage. I encourage that. That's awesome. If you're out in nature, you do you, boo boo. I love it. But then who's going to hold the people accountable who do not care? Like I've seen some people in the comments or someone said it, mentioned it earlier. Like someone wanting to get a button buck and whatnot, which is, if I catch you with a button buck, I'm going to whip your tail.
Yeah,
That's
I mean,
how I feel.
I don't mean to be rude at all, but we have to sort of look at some accountability and say, well, why do these horrible kind of people exist? Because everyone else sees animals as objects. So even if you're the complete opposite of that kind of person, the fact that you will go out and take a life and see an animal as a resource is exactly the same mentality that they're using to just stand at the other end of the spectrum. The problem is that animals are being seen as resources.
I also want to mention too that there are instances where we have actions that are illegal, but people still do them, and we investigate and then put them in the court system, that just because people are going to do something doesn't mean that it's futile to not do it, for everybody to at least try. There's always going to be somebody that does something outside of what we deem ethical, but that doesn't mean we don't have to practice that.
And I would say, like, in the same way that you care so much about poaching, right? Like, you would go out of your way to make sure that justice that justice prevails in the case of poaching. We feel the same way about that in general, right? About the exploitation of animals. Like in a vegan world, if everybody cared as much about animals and their inherent rights to exist free from harm, everybody would be trying to stop people from hurting animals. In the same way that you want to stop people from poaching. So just trying to say that who's going to help, do this, like, well, we should, right? Like, we need to change our perspectives on exploitation of animals. And then all of that will come naturally. There's game wardens, right, that help with poaching. Well, in the future, if biodiversity continues to decrease as we're seeing, like, eventually we're going to get to the point where we can't hunt anymore. There aren't enough animals to hunt. And at that point, game wardens are going to be protecting those animals from everybody, right? So hopefully we don't have to get to that point. And more people, I think we're already seeing a decline in the hunting population. Since about 1980, we've had 50% decrease in the hunting population of registered hunters. So I think we're already seeing a trend towards more people doing things like photography, like backpacking and camping, rock climbing, outdoor activities that don't exploit wildlife directly. Or require the unaliving of sentient animals that can experience suffering. So I think, the more this trend happens, and the more people that develop empathy or have compassion for wildlife, the less people that would be doing these, hateful or harmful things towards wildlife.
Okay. Well, if that's how you feel of you contributing and acting in conservation, that's totally fine. I have nothing bad to say about that. There's no hate whatsoever. I guess we just have different views, and like I said, it doesn't bother me one bit, but I still make my stand on hunting is conservation.
Okay. Well, I would push back and say you haven't really put forward an argument, to support your position. But I understand, as a former hunter, I do understand that you really want to confirm, to yourself that the taking of animals is somehow justified. But I would just encourage you, to think about that individual that you're taking, from its family, from its role in the ecosystem, and really consider that whether it's necessary. Are you still going to go to the grocery store and buy other animal products? Are you still contributing to the suffering of these sentient animals? And I would very much encourage you to consider how, like, that taking of a life out of nature, does impact the conservation, with inside of an ecosystem. So I really appreciate you coming up and speaking to us. But I think we're going to move on to the next guest.
All righty. Thank you.
Thanks. Have a great day.
You too.
All right. It's almost 5 o'clock here, so I might be winding down. My voice is getting a little cracky, but let's see. I got a few more people here that I think have been waiting for a while. Let's get up. Oh man, your name's a little concerning, but we'll see. Jesse drinks milk. Drink milk. Is that your real last name?
Yes, sir.
Is it really?
I'm actually in the shower. I've been waiting. I had to hop in the shower, but I can still talk.
Okay.
Like here in Wisconsin, we didn't have a wolf population for a long time. So crops and things like that, deer especially, they'd eat our crops. Things that, corn. We have large sweet corn. We grow a lot of sweet corn in Wisconsin, and we eat that. As a population, we eat a lot of corn and things like that. Soybeans, green beans, things like that. We didn't have a wolf population up until, I think, 2015, 2016. We didn't have a gray wolf population in Wisconsin. And they've just recently introduced the gray wolves. Well, their population has gotten very large in recent years. The deer population has gone down. So we may think as people, well, hunting is not conservation. As the deer population has gotten driven down, a lot of people recently, other than large food plots and things on people's land, we don't see a lot of deer anymore. A lot less hunting has happened, but the rise in the wolf population has gone. The wolf population has risen, and we don't have a wolf hunting season. People's cattle, other livestock, it helps, but like wolf hunting and things of that sort, I think it'd be conservation for the deer population because that has gotten driven down.
You guys might
The deer season. But even if we got rid of the deer season, the wolf population is still going to grow until the deer population is diminished. Granted, it'll even itself out eventually. I still think that to keep like our crop yield and things like that, so animals aren't eating our crops and things of that sort.
So I'm hearing some contradictions though, because it sounds like you're saying the deer populations are declining because of wolves, but then you're saying that in order to help with your crops, protecting your crops, you need to kill wolves and deer? Is that,
No.
Clarify
No,
your argument
so-
a little bit for me.
But the wolf population rises, they're killing animals, crops, livestock, or not crops, but livestock and other things.
Can I ask a question really quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
You had mentioned like there was no wolf population, and then you said with the wolf population increase that deer.
Yeah, they were,
the deer
they were reintroduced into our ecosystem.
Let me finish really quick, please. So yeah, you said they were reintroduced and the deer population decreased, indicating that that was a form of conservation, and that like managing the populations of these deer is conservation. That's at least what I gathered. I wanted to ask you, what happened to the wolves in the first place?
Our ancestors,
So they hunted the wolves.
they hunted the wolves out of
So we
and
hunted.
large, hold on a second, I got one more thing, and large deforestation efforts when settlers first came to Wisconsin. So like Germans and people like that, they started settling here. There was large deforestation,
Sure, yeah,
farm fields and things like that.
I understand that, but I just want to express here. You'd mentioned that we hunted the wolves, which in turn raised the deer population, which caused a negative effect on conservation until reintroducing the wolves. So the thing that started this problem in the first place was hunting. It was hunting, and that's why we're saying hunting is not conservation.
But now that the deer population is going down due to the wolf population, wouldn't it be conservation for deer population to introduce a wolf season?
Yeah,
No,
so
it wouldn't.
I think if I can respond to this, though, like I think this is a misunderstanding of like ecological functions. Like predators do have natural mechanisms of population control exerted on them just in nature.
Right.
There's competition, there's carrying capacity,
Yep.
and from what I can read here, it looks like wolves only take about 5 to 10% of the deer population annually. So they're not having that much of an impact on the deer population. It's likely that changing, land usage has had bigger impacts on destabilizing the deer populations. So I think, looking at it and just being like, well, obviously the wolves are eating all the deer. I think that's a little like oversimplifying like the ecological functions that are actually happening. And I think when we look at healthy ecosystems, we have balance, right? And there are
Right.
population booms and busts, right? Like prey species will get to a certain level, but then the wolves come in and their species get to a certain level, their population gets to a certain level, and then it gets balanced out. And then, there are booms and busts within these populations. So, looking at a 5-year time period doesn't really do a good service to like the ecosystem functions for these animals. So we need to be looking at a longer time period. And just because now we're just now getting to where people are kind of a little bit more okay with having wolves in the ecosystem, I don't think that now all of a sudden we should come in and say, well, obviously we have to start, hunting the wolves because they're going to get out of control. That's just like a misunderstanding of the other parts within an ecosystem, the other mechanisms of population control. And oftentimes when humans get involved with managing populations, it actually causes more disruptions within ecosystems than good. Oftentimes because hunters are wanting to exploit those animals, right? And so much regulation and studies have to go into it to properly and sustainably do these things, right? And so it's so difficult to do that, and it's unnecessary, right?
Right.
Hunting is not a form of conservation because hunting at its core is an exploitation of wildlife, and conservation is the opposite of that. Conservation is trying to protect and maintain these ecosystems. So, of course, it would be better to just step back and let the ecosystem balance out naturally through these natural mechanisms.
Right.
Cool. Okay. So you
Yep.
agree?
Right, I guess.
Yeah.
I do hunt. I am a hunter though. So, you think about it though, like when I buy my deer licenses and things like that, my fishing license, etc. A lot of that money goes back into the ecosystem and conservation wardens, etc.
Yeah, so I'm not sure how long you've been here, but I'll definitely restate, the like, I guess, data for funding. So Pittman-Robertson Act is the main funder for hunting related taxes. It's an 11% tax on apparel, ammunition, weapons, all of those things related to hunting. A year or two ago, that was like $1 billion in conservation funding, which is not insignificant. But the USDA through land and wildlife conservation programs allotted $8 billion in the same year. So hunting funding for conservation is a small portion, a very small portion, less than 10% really, of conservation funding.
Did you look up the stats for that in Wisconsin?
Yeah, so I'm not sure state by state, but federally, we can look at this. We do have studies. A really good study shows that 94% of conservation funding comes from non-hunting funding, mostly from taxpayers.
Yep.
So, and I would also say that, that Pittman-Robertson Act and a lot of the funding to the states actually goes to land management practices that prioritize hunting interests, specifically like management of land for game species like deer, turkey, other species that hunters want to exploit, which oftentimes overlooks other species for a broader conservation focus. We've lost 3 million different birds over the last, I think, 30 years. And in that same time, we've had huge increases in a lot of these prey, populations that hunters are wanting to exploit. So, through that perspective, we kind of realize that not only is hunting playing a very, very small role in the funding for conservation, but it's also doing a disservice to a lot of the ecosystem functions that we have through the management specific for hunting.
Right. I guess that's all I have, but
cool. We'll let you get back to your shower, man. I appreciate you coming up.
Thanks, dude. Yeah.
All right. Have a good one.
Yep.
Let's see who else. Got a few people. I'm trying to figure out who's been here the longest, but Bombaclot. That's a funny name. Let's see. We've got one more gifter here. King of the Mustangs. Probably gifting to some of the other people, but whatever. They've been involved.
Yep.
How's it going, King? What's up?
So, first of all, hunting is 100% conservation, and it's a very religious and spiritual thing for a lot of people.
How is hunting conservation?
So, do you know what zombie deer is?
Are you referring to CWD?
Yeah, it's put on by overpopulation of deer.
Yep.
It spreads from deer's feces, and it can actually get into cows, and it can get into your horses and stuff like that. That's why conservation is a thing, to take away diseases like that.
Okay, so I would counter that by saying that there are actually studies that show hunting practices, specifically bad hunting practices, but hunting practices nonetheless, contribute to an increased spread of these issues. And actually, predators such as mountain lions or wolves actually can reduce the spread of these diseases much more efficiently than hunters can, because hunters are taking those carcasses of animals out of the ecosystem, whereas these predators are actually consuming the majority of those carcasses and degrading them and pooping out and reducing the spread of diseases. So both through the culling of predators, but also through the actual hunting of these animals that could potentially have chronic wasting disease, we're actually making the spread of this disease worse. So by that argument, I would say that hunting is still not conservation.
Do you know what? Clearly, you've never been in an area that's overpopulated. But okay.
I can definitely speak to the overpopulation as well, King, if you want me to. So I'm not sure how long you've been here, but hunting practices, as far as land management practices, often do artificially increase the population of things like deer. If you're concerned about chronic wasting disease. So if we're concerned about overpopulation or overabundance of these deer species, we should be looking at practices like land management practices that increase those populations. And a lot of times the funding from hunting, the tags, as well as the Pittman-Robertson Act, 11% tax on apparel, ammunition, and guns, actually contributes to these land management practices that increase those prey populations, deer, turkey, quail, doves, and contribute to land management practices, that are trying to increase, those populations for the benefit of hunters.
At the end of the day, us hunters aren't going anywhere. Get over it. Because here's the thing. It's a very spiritual thing.
No, that's okay. If you just want to, state weird facts like that, we can move on. The fact is that we've had a 50% decline in the hunting population over the last 4 decades, since the 80s. So, if you're saying we're not going anywhere or hunters are not going anywhere, you'd actually be mistaken, because the evidence is actually against you on that one.
I'm going to grab some water. If y'all want to add anything, I'll be right back.
I was going to say, equating spirituality to unnecessary violence is kind of cringe.
Yeah, where do you think he was going with that? Was it that I pay respect to the animal and the sacrifice route?
Yeah, I just don't know any instance where you can logically say that I like to unnecessarily end a life because it's spiritual. Like, super weird.
It's kind of like counterintuitive. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that actually none of the guests have brought up so far, but I've seen it at least a dozen times in the chat, is, well, the one thing that hunters do is we use all of the animal, which is what factory farms do.
Yeah, I would
Right.
honestly say that factory farms use more of the animal than
Yeah,
hunters do.
absolutely, yeah. I mean, I can't remember which guest it was, but one of them said, we can't eat the antlers. Well, they'd get ground down for like blood meal or whatever, right? They would be used, or they'd be sold as dog treats or any number of things, but they
Yeah,
would be used. Yeah,
all
absolutely.
the way
Every
down
part
to
of
the
it.
bones being like processed for like gelatin and stuff.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Or used as, like, I mean, some of my family turns them into furniture, like door handles, and they come up with all sorts of ridiculous uses. But yeah, I mean, half the time the majority of the animal is thrown into a pit and buried.
Yeah,
Whereas like a predator would be consuming a lot of that, and then you have the mesopredators and the detritivores who are consuming, the rest of that carcass. So it's like, to argue that hunting somehow has the same role as predators or mesopredators is just absolutely, like, ridiculous.
yeah.
Let's see who else we've got here. Chronic Panda. That's an interesting name. Let's see if you can load up for us.
Hey, brother, I had just a couple questions that I just thought of as we were talking because I do agree with you. My background, I had a background in animal medicine, so I was for the animals for a long time. But and my family are hunters as well. So my question is about Native American cultures, and then overpopulation in the sense of Florida, because I came up when that girl was talking about Florida, specifically with carp. Not there, like in Michigan, I think they have overpopulations of carp and stuff like that, catfish, iguanas, and other invasive species that were introduced by us accidentally or purposefully.
Okay, so which one would you like to start with? Indigenous cultures?
Whichever one.
Okay.
It's on you.
Yeah, so we could start with the culture. I mean, I grew up in a culture that was pretty racist and had a lot of different negative things that I won't get into, but I chose to step outside of that. Now, I'm not drawing a comparison between indigenous peoples and my
Yeah,
culture.
that would be a little far fetched because I mean, one is thousands of years old and one is something we created.
Well,
As a
all culture is human created, though, right?
Yeah, I got you. Yeah, that was wrong. But yeah, continue. I'm sorry.
And I think we, as each generation, has a responsibility, to analyze our cultural practices, and that's why I'm like comparing to my culture. Like, as I grew up, I realized that the things that I was taught in my culture weren't necessarily things I wanted to propagate, into the future.
Oh yeah, very much so. Like, I don't want to do the bad things that happened to my father or his grandfather, and we have the ability because we're humans to change, and we hope so. But I mean, a correlation between racism and this is where we come with the spiritual beliefs of natives and like whale hunting, how they're allowed to take 1 or 2 whales a year and that kind of stuff. But again, continue.
Yeah, so I would just argue that we still have an obligation to analyze our cultural practices and see where we can improve them. Just because something is a cultural practice doesn't justify that, right? So like there are other things like a lot of what I respect within indigenous communities is like a respect for nature, a connection with nature, looking to have a spiritual like relationship with nature, and I think that's something to honor and to value. But that doesn't have to come at the cost of a sentient creature's life, right? So we can still participate in spiritual practices and through connection with nature by doing nonviolent activities in nature. So I personally would argue that a lot of the things that trying to justify hunting or something as an indigenous practice, if we're still going to the grocery store and we're participating in capitalism and through modern farming,
no, I 100% agree with you. It's I mean the natives the natives didn't kill off the buffalo, they're very much only taking what they would consume, and so okay, that I agree with you, and we are, because it's 2024, can say, hey, you don't have to do this. And I mean, people argue about our teeth structure and everything like that, but we're omnivores and we were barely meat eaters anyway. So the next part is specifically Florida and the fish populations that are exploding. That's what I see a lot. And what would you do about that? And like iguanas,
Yeah,
and like,
so I really enjoy the invasive species discussion because it's something that I also struggled with for a very long time. Growing up in the forestry industry, I was taught that there were a lot of specific plants that are considered invasive, even native plants that were considered to be threats to the timber industry, right? So growing up, I had this weird sentiment towards certain trees like sweet gums.
Where are you from?
So I'm from South Carolina.
Oh, okay, I'm from California, so I know about invasive plants, especially in the redwoods, and then poaching of all of our succulents and stuff. So, you know, it's a big thing. You want to save this bug, but you got to take out 3 different species because this bug was here first. But so, like, what would? Sorry for interrupting again. But
No, you're good. You're good. So my argument with invasive species would be that a lot of times our perspective on invasive species and even just the way we define invasive species comes down to the impact on human, like essentially economics. A lot of times we're looking at the impact on maybe the timber industry, on maybe some agricultural production, or things like that that impact humans and human society. So that's a very anthropocentric view, right? So when we step back and we look at the ecosystem functions of different invasive species, sometimes over the long term, like hundreds or thousands of years, these invasive species could be new keystone species, right? So we can actually do a disservice to ecosystems sometimes by getting too involved and trying to extirpate certain species, whether that be animals, plants, or whatever. Sometimes that could be a disservice to the future development of these ecosystems. Now, I'm not arguing that we should take no intervention with invasive species, but I think that there are more ethical approaches to addressing invasive species than extirpation or completely unaliving and kind of waging like war on these species. So that I would still argue that hunting is not. I switched my camera, but hunting is not a valid form of conservation, and the fact that there are other more ethical ways to approach the issue of invasive species.
So what's a more ethical way? Like, for the big thing for me is there's salmon returning to the Bay Area, especially in San Jose, and it's crazy, right? But that's because we've restructured everything, cleaned everything up, took out these species that weren't there, and now something that's returning 200 years ago that you wouldn't think we'd have salmon in the Bay Area, but it's happening. So
I think salmon in the Bay Area, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's due to the removal of some dams throughout the river.
There's dams, but they did a lot. I got to read up on the articles again, but it's really close to me. So yeah, but there's stuff that we created that causes extinction, and it's a real not a gray area, but I'm pretty center with it. You got to get rid of something to make something back. But at what point do you take the step forward, like you're saying, and say, hey, this might be.
Like I think the best hunter argument that's harder to argue is like about, say, Burmese pythons or.
Oh no, well that too. That's another. It's basically Florida is running. Florida used to have. It's happening in Mexico as well, but Florida.
I mean, it's happening all over the world.
So many invasive species.
And I mean, my argument still though that
90% was created by us. And
my argument would still be that there are ethical approaches that we can take rather than waging war and hurting individuals that are already existing in these ecosystems, which are typically a response to either human disturbance or human exploitation, like in the sense of feral hogs. A lot of people don't know.
No, that's another one.
Those are escapees of former animal.
Oh yeah, no, it only takes 2 generations for a pig to go feral.
But there are alternatives to hunting, right? So like we could introduce forms of birth control to these animals. We could catch and feed them.
I 100% agree. I mean, but are you going to sit there and sterilize 1,000 iguanas? And like. The biggest impact I personally see in my life is fish. 'Cause everything starts from fish. We came from fish in the beginning. You see these impacts of these habitats from invasive species of fish, and they multiply like crazy. And some fish, like the snakehead, which was introduced from China, right? We have an American snakehead, but there's also another snakehead. It's like you said, there's ethical things, but at one point, does ethical mean like? I think the rule in Florida, you catch one of those, you're just supposed to leave it on the bank, right? You're not supposed to put it back in the water, especially or like plecostomuses as well. And those things multiply and grow up to like 28 inches.
Yeah, I would still argue though that it's unethical. Like these are individuals that are capable of suffering, and it's not their fault that they are there.
Yeah. So I agree with you, man. I was a vegetarian for a long time because I mean I love my animals. I grew up with horses, cows, chickens out in the Central Valley, so it's not like I was actually one of the first people that didn't want a gun when we turned 14 to go hunting. I ended up still going hunting and stuff like that, but I see a comparison with how you said hunting has died in the last 50% since the 80s, because it did. One of my cousins still hunts all the time. I personally don't. I can shoot a gun. I'm great at it, but it just, it's not relatively around anymore. So I do agree with you. At what point do we switch our minds too and be like, hey,
I think we need to change, our views on conservation, because so many people like myself, like I grew up hunting, I was 26 before I stopped hunting. And my view on conservation was that hunting was a valid part of conservation. It was a tool of conservation. But the more
I'm in my 30s too, so it's like I've been around, and I just wanted anybody in the comments, but well, I really appreciate this, brother, and I see what you're saying, and I readily agree with you. But on the invasive species, if we could sit there and if we we do it with cats. We sit and round up all the cats, neuter, spay them, let them live their lives.
Right.
Maybe science is not advanced enough for us to do this with all these other species yet, but if we could do it ethically, I'm on board with it,
Yeah, but, I think we're definitely there. It's more of the sentiment and the demand for, options like that, because we still do have.
Oh, no, we definitely don't have sentiment. We're a lot of these people are just like, I love hunting. And it's like, do you love hunting, or you just like the killing aspect of it? And it's an adrenaline rush. I get it. I saw it, and I like, it's questions you have to ask yourself personally, and what do you really like about it?
For sure. Well, I appreciate you coming up, man.
Of course, brother. Have a good day.
You too.
Thank you.
Yeah. Another invasives argument. I mean, it's worth kind of repeating, that these are animals that are typically responding to human disturbance or human exploitation. In the case of Burmese pythons being released in the Everglades, or from a hurricane coming through and them escaping their habitats where people were exploiting them. Same with feral hogs. These are animals that were escapees from animal agriculture. So determining that they have no right to exist when they were historically being exploited is kind of ridiculous. And then treating them like some kind of infestation is just, I think a form of bigotry, really. You're treating them differently just for the species that they are, for being there. And they have the same amount of rights as any other animal to be there. Just because they're not native or that they're an alien species shouldn't determine their moral worth. There are plenty of new technologies like birth control to help these animals. We could also be rounding them up and humanely relocating them into proper environments or into enclosed areas and sanctuaries where they wouldn't have economic impacts on things. So, I just want to get that out, because we were kind of talking over each other a little bit there. But
well, I also want to mention, like, more times than not, like there's limited cases in which somebody can actually present where a species overpopulation is actually occurring and having that detrimental effect on the ecosystem that they are referring to, especially ones that cannot be managed using means fairly like practically, So it's like they use this argument, but there's not really like a whole bunch of data that supports, well, yeah, like in case of like carp and iguanas, they're not terribly affecting the ecosystems where they're overpopulating in Michigan. I'm from Michigan originally, and I heard all those arguments before, and same with deer overpopulation and all that stuff. There's no places in Michigan aside from the highways and maybe some farmland where deer might be grazing, where there's actually an overabundance issue,
Right. Yep. And I do want to address, I see some comments about funding. I mean, I'm well aware of the Pittman-Robertson Act, as well as a few other taxes and the fees and tags and everything that hunters pay, but that's just a very small portion of overall conservation funding. The vast majority of conservation funding, upwards of 94% in the United States, comes from non-hunting related sources, mostly from taxpayers. So, yeah.
you can get out of here with that ridiculous claim and go maybe do a little bit more research before. Oh man. All right. I think one more guess probably. I think we're at an hour and a half, maybe two. So probably into here after the next guest. Let's see. Bombaclat has been here for like quite a while, but I'm kind of concerned about some troll potential here. What's up, Bombaclat? I cannot hear you if you're speaking. Like I saw your mic come on, but I can't hear anything you're saying.
You hear me now? Hello?
It's very muted. I'm not sure if you're far away from the phone or what.
So weird.
Oh, there we go. That's better.
Oh, maybe it was just a glitch or something. All right. So I'm a conservation major, environmental planning and conservation, I should say, and I have 2 other minors in related fields. This is basically all I know. I'm not going to say.
Can I safely assume that you're also a hunter?
I will say now that I am not currently a hunter. I have not hunted in the past several years, so okay. I'm not going to consider myself a current hunter now. Okay. But I will definitely say that I did enjoy hunting growing up, and it is something that I do plan to pursue later on in life, and then also to share to my children.
Okay. Why is that? And then we'll get back to the why is hunting conservation. So tell me why you think hunting is worth kind of perpetuating in society.
So for me personally, it's a Native American heritage thing. Native American. So it's something that we pass on to our children, and it's the values that we instill. So
what is it specifically about hunting that you think is a good cultural practice to like pass on?
It's not so much so that it's a good practice. It's just something that you have to be able to appreciate,
Why do you have to appreciate it?
Because we grew up eating a lot of our own meat. So meat that we went out and either, hunted for, or we also had, several meat animals. We mainly had goats and chickens, but
I grew up the same way, but I don't think the culture that we're born into or the traditions that we're born into necessarily like validate the morality of the actions within those cultures. So I would argue that, the exploitation of animals, specifically on the topic of hunting, is unnecessary exploitation, and it's not really a good, practice to be perpetuating in society, especially given that we're in the state of a major biodiversity crisis. If you look at the map of farmed animals versus wild animals, it's really shocking, to understand the dwindling numbers of wildlife that we have. So to perpetuate this idea of exploitation of wildlife is kind of like a dying, culture, I think. And the more we try to continue that practice, the more likely it is that we will have less and less wildlife in the future.
Do you guys mind if I inquire really quick before we move on to conservation? Because I just want to test some consistency in here when we're addressing culture. Do you extend this sentiment to like every culture or just specific cultures?
This is not a cultural thing. This is a personal family, this is what I plan to pass on to my children.
Well, when you express like it was something that was like passed down culturally, right? Like you specifically.
It's not something that was passed down culturally. Let me refrain from saying that. Sorry. It's something that was passed on to me from my family. Mm-hmm. It's something that I learned their values of, that they learned from their family.
So that's passing down culture, though. Like you understand that, right?
Yes, I do understand that. But
okay, so does that sentiment only like, do you extend that only to like you and your way of living and people that, or do you extend that to everybody who claims that their culture might justify something because it was passed down to them as well?
I'm not going to say, I'm not arguing with a Janist. I'm not going to say that, nothing has life. I personally am very anthropocentric.
That's not what I'm asking. I'm asking specifically because you mentioned like you think that we should perpetuate this because we are we learn it from previous generations in our culture. I'm specifically asking if you extend that to all cultures, or just like yours and your way of life and people who adhere to that.
Like I was going to say, you can't exactly do that because there's some cultures that do not at all believe killing is adequate.
So I'm not just expressing killing. I'm just asking, like, culturally, like you're expressing that you think we should do something that might be unethical because you've learned it, it's been passed down to you. I'm asking if you extend that to every culture, whether it's for life, for hunting, against hunting, whatever the case might be. Do you extend that sentiment to all cultures, or is it specifically to you?
I would guess just to myself. I'm, again, saying it was more so a family value. So it's not really a cultural thing that would extend out.
So I think what Ozark's trying to get at, Bamaclat, I love saying your name, is like, say I was born into a racist household, right? And my family cherished racist values. Would it then be justified for me to say, well, I was born this way, and, my culture is this way, and my family practiced this way, so I want to pass this on? Like, that wouldn't be consistently logical, right? If we can agree that there are certain practices that, maybe people are born into in their families that need to be considered morally and ethically, then, we can't apply that elsewhere and use that as justification for continually doing something, especially when there's a victim involved.
Well, you're saying that hunting is unethical. I disagree.
Okay.
And I'm going to say that because you two seem to have not exactly the biocentric egalitarian mindset, but something very similar to it, where you're placing, intrinsic value into all.
I don't place value on much. I just respect that other individuals have rights to not be exploited if they don't have to.
Yeah, and I think we respect, like, sentience, right? So, like, if you were saying my culture was to go out and forage mushrooms, I would have no problem with that. I'd be like, cool, that's awesome. Connect with nature, go out, harvest a mushroom, the fruiting body of a fungi. Nobody's really getting hurt. But when you say that my culture or my traditions are to hurt animals, and to cause suffering to animals, that's where we have an ethical issue, because there is a victim involved with your actions, and trying to justify the culture on that could, if you were morally consistent on that, applying it to other situations, that would imply a lot of really horrible things that we could justify through culture or tradition.
Yeah, I was going to use the Pashtuns and childhood marriage as my example, but I guess racism works too. But that's why, like I say, it's important to not use, like, generational teachings to justify our actions, And I just wanted to address that, but I didn't want to get too far off topic. We're definitely interested in hearing what you have to say about conservation and hunting with that. I just kind of wanted to see where you were at with your ethics when it came to, like, completely respecting all cultures, or if it was specific to you. So thanks for clarifying.
Yeah, no, like I said, I'm not going to say that I'm right in any way, shape, or form in anything that I'm saying. These are just my own personal values from the things that I've picked up over my life. Everybody has their own perspectives. That's fair to throw out there. Everybody's going to see things different. It's obvious. Sure. I'm just saying that through my studying and researching in my schooling, I just had this environmental ethics course this last semester in college. I was reading over Paul Taylor's article. I forget what it was. It was Biocentric Egalitarianism. So I was reading over that, and it got me thinking that this biocentric egalitarian, putting respect into everything, it often takes away that humans are still a part of nature. We are still very much so a part of the food web, regardless of what anything you would want to say. If we fell right now, there would be huge effects. Sorry.
Can you clarify on that, though? Because when you say we're part of nature, like, does that mean, like, you're living outside like a wild animal? Does that mean, like, you're not using tools? Because, like, a lot of human society has been us removing ourselves from, the food web, like you're saying. When we consume food, we typically flush it down the toilet after we've digested it. Like we're not going outside and, going defecating in holes and stuff, right? Like wild animals. Most of us aren't. I mean, I've been there camping and stuff, no doubt. But, to argue that what do you say? The utilitarian egalitarian, is that right?
No, biocentric egalitarianism.
Yeah, so I think that argument, is kind of weird to try to say that we're part of an ecosystem. So therefore we need to like go out and unalive animals to make sure we continue to be part of the ecosystem. Like humans have had.
That's not quite exactly what I was getting at.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm gonna interrupt you. What I'm saying is the processes that we do, the activities that humans partake in, anything that humans are able to think of, create, do, whatever you want it to be, it's all a part of nature. It's all something that is going to happen regardless of what anybody has or wants to say, because that is what is meant to happen. It's the sort of destiny, the fate mindset.
So can I pause really quick and ask, because I have to kind of go back to similarly what I was asking you about culture, but do you extend this to all of the actions that humans do as well?
Yes. I would have to if I'm going to be saying that, yes.
Including the unethical stuff that we have laws against. The reason I'm asking to test consistency to make sure we're on the same page. I'm not trying to like corner you or anything. I'm just trying to understand.
No, I understand, and I have to hold it to from the creation or discovery of fire to the manipulation of the atom for the atomic bomb. Yes, that's
I'm not necessarily just talking about that, but I'm talking about everything in between that happens naturally in the ecosystems, including stuff like grape and infanticide and all that stuff, because those are stuff that we actively have laws against and try to avoid, but they're very common in ecosystems.
Nature. Everything that happens is nature.
So
this is not something I personally hold. Let me also get that out there. This is just something I argue.
We got to step back a little bit. We got to step back. So now you're saying that through your biocentric egalitarianism, you're justifying SA, grape, smurder, like all of these things, and just saying, well, it's natural. Like, so you go into the courtroom and your only argument is, sorry, it was natural. I was just doing what nature is doing.
I am not saying that it is right. I'm saying that in the realness of the world, that's what it is.
Sure. Just because these things exist, we have the capacity to, try to define ethics and make decisions based on what we can determine to be right or wrong to the best of our ability. Now, I'm not saying that everybody agrees on that specifically, but as a society, we generally move towards what we deem as right, and that's constantly improving. I don't think like biocentric egalitarianism really expresses that we don't have to do that. In fact, I think that it would be human nature that we are doing that. So
human nature that we are
making the ethical decisions and ethical what's the term I'm looking for? Inquiries on what is ethical and what is not ethical. That is also inherently part of our nature. Therefore, it is part of nature as well. All biocentric egalitarianism is the idea that all living things are an equal moral status and inherent worth, including humans. That's all it is in a nutshell. It doesn't determine that it determines whatever morals that we extend to ourselves, that in order to be consistent, we need to extend that to others as well. So I don't really understand how that has anything to do with, everything being inherently a part of nature or really conservation in general.
With saying that everything has, intrinsic value is placing everything in nature, no?
No, it's saying that everything has an equal moral status and inherent worth, including humans. That doesn't necessarily have to appeal to nature. That's just this simple. It's a human concept, and that's a simple extension of moral consideration. To other beings. Like me, if I don't want somebody to unnecessarily harm me because I'm an autonomous individual with my own subjective experience. Applying this philosophy would indicate that I need to extend that to others as well, meaning that I will not go out of my way to unnecessarily exploit another individual. That's all it's saying is giving moral consideration. It's very similar to like sentientism and even like anybody who claims to be a biocentric egalitarian and should be practicing veganism and definitely not practicing or like supporting any hunting practices.
Well, they can't because they think that plants are going to have the same value as a human.
Yeah, but we'd have to approach that from a utilitarian standpoint because when we look at the overall consumption of plants and on the trophic scale, it takes a lot more plants to produce calories and consume them from the animals than eating the plants themselves. So more plants are harmed, more plants and animals are harmed for animal consumption than they are for plant consumption. That's according to the second law of thermodynamics.
You didn't have to go into the thermodynamics part of it, but yes, that is obvious that it's not only using up way more energy, but more water as well.
So I just want to, and then I'll wrap my end up really quick. I just want to express, so the moral consideration that would go to plants in this instance is that I am choosing a diet that ends up consuming less plants overall because I don't have to worry about the energy wasting that happens by consuming the animals. And I'm also extending moral consideration to the animals as well because I am not unnecessarily ending their life when I have a more efficient option.
Okay. That's fair enough, I guess. But when it comes to in terms of the biocentric egalitarian and like an anthropocentric viewpoint, where do you draw the line of nature?
Well, biocentric egalitarianism seems like it's a bit antithetical to the other one, anthropocentrism, because anthropocentrism focuses on humans and gives humans more value, right? So I'm not sure if you were trying to conflate them or separate them. Could you be a little more clear?
No, so I'm trying to find like you're bringing in the utilitarian mindset of using less to get more.
Well, that's the only way to address that problem because we need to eat, right? But we don't need to choose the most harmful option. So if we don't need to exploit individuals and we ultimately end up sacrificing less plants, then that's where I would draw the line, necessity versus desire, right? The line is right in between there.
But in terms of hunting, there's a big difference between like hunting and when you're eating, say, non-organic,
Yeah, but most people that hunt are also eating crops, right? Like there's very few instances on the planet where people solely or mostly have to rely on hunting out of necessity, and we have to grant consideration to them because a lot of them are born in those conditions and it's not necessarily their fault that they are there as long as they are making the best decisions that they can to, be as ethical about it as they can given their circumstance. But for most people like that are hunting, they're only hunting for like a small part of the year. And then they're going and shopping at grocery stores, whether it be to buy more other animal products or plant-based agricultural products as well, because people aren't mostly eating meat. They're mostly eating plants.
Yeah, that's the consumer lifestyle though.
Sure. I mean,
but
I'm just trying to express so that argument with crops and hunting is kind of like a moot point if somebody's shopping at the grocery store.
Yeah. And I mean, you're still choosing to violate the rights, the negative rights, being free from harm, or suffering of an individual. In the same way that if you go to the store, and pay somebody else to violate that animal, it's essentially the same violation, just indirect. You're not directly doing it; you're still directly contributing to it. Whereas something like crop deaths or stuff like that would be indirect deaths, and something our agricultural practices could improve to further reduce. So I'm not really sure what kind of like I'm glad you brought up the biocentric egalitarianism, because that's kind of like a cool position to consider. But yeah, I mean, trying to argue that it's somehow anthropocentric for us to say, hey, this deer has an inherent right to not be violated is a really weird position. Maybe that's not what you were saying. Maybe you were trying to some other position.
That would be the biocentric position, is to say that. But it was more so like in terms of how could I describe this better? When you're thinking of what it costs to the environment, you were, using the examples of energy and water, but the long-term damage effects, I think, could be much different from these viewpoints, because the long-term effects of farming, I feel like, are going to be much worse than that of hunting. And even though,
so it's a false dichotomy, right?
Connected, right?
Sorry, go ahead, Andy.
No, I was going to say, you understand that they're connected, right? Because not everybody is able to go hunting. So say, like, for example, you lived in an apartment block in the middle of Manhattan. Hunting is not really an option, but going to the store is. And so even if you were to push the idea that everybody should hunt, you just run out of free living beings. You just run out of other animals. The reason that we have factory farming, the reason that we have that mass industry is because of mass demand. And so all you're doing is perpetuating that demand by saying, hey, deers are also resources. These wild hogs are also resources. These birds are also resources. And people that can't go hunting will still want to consume them or wear their skin or whatever use they want to benefit from. So for as long as one happens, the other will fill the gap. That's how we got here today. I mean, people like to remind us all the time that our ancestors hunted. Right, they didn't factory farm. That's what we're doing now because of the demand. So for as long as that demand exists, the supply will exist.
Factory farming has cost us.
But I mean, Bomaclot, like my position on this would be like I would like to explain to you that like we can improve farming, right? Like we can make industrial farming have less crop deaths. We can make it less detrimental to the environment through using compost rather than synthetic fertilizers, using no-till practices, using cover crops. But there's no way to make killing or unaliving of an animal, whether that's hunting or whether that's in a factory farm or whether that's the best treated cow, on a grass-fed, lifestyle. Either way, within animal agriculture or hunting, you are violating the right of an animal. You are taking their existence from them, right, directly. Whereas with farming, we can improve that. We can reduce the amount of crop deaths, and those are indirect deaths, right? Like the farmer's not going out like, I got to unalive all these animals, and we don't have to use pesticides. There are alternatives to pesticides that can reduce our vulnerability to these pest insects. So trying to argue, that hunting is somehow better, well, that's a false dichotomy because farming can be way better. And involve no direct death.
In terms of greenhouse gases, though?
Absolutely, yeah. So veganic farming actually can sequester far more carbon, than any type of regenerative agriculture even. But it's actually interesting if you look into this. Factory farmed cows actually have less methane emissions than grass-fed cows because of what they're being fed, as well as the length of time that it takes to raise them. Grass-fed animals take a lot longer to raise, so they're producing more greenhouse gases. And with veganic farming, or even with just standard farming practices, there is no methane emissions, right? And methane is far more damaging to the environment, than animal agriculture. So, I mean, yeah, absolutely. And if we're talking about comparing it to hunting, absolutely. Again, like you are literally exploiting the few remaining wildlife that we have, right, in order to get your supply of flesh that you want to enjoy, compared to just going and having a small garden and getting the same amount of calories from like 1,000 square feet. You know, like it's not comparable. And if we're trying to talk utilitarian, environmentalism, like, yeah, like farming could be way better than hunting. I think your mic like disconnected or glitched out again.
Are you able to hear me now?
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, I don't know what that is. I don't know of any cow farm that doesn't produce methane. I can't see that being possible because that's one of the biggest sources of.
Nobody made that claim.
I thought I heard you say that there were some farms that were producing almost no methane.
No, said less methane. Like factory farmed cows produce less methane than grass-fed cows because grass-fed cows have a longer life cycle than factory farmed cows before they're slaughtered.
Yeah, and also the feed emissions from grains versus grass. There's different methane emission ratios as well.
Well, what processes goes into getting all the grain created, and then not only created but bagged, and then
you're literally you're arguing our point for us. Like, animal agriculture is inherently unsustainable.
That's going exactly to say that as of the current moment right now, hunting is the better option.
So
but this is a false dichotomy again, man. Like, it's a false dichotomy. We're not talking about animal farming versus hunting.
Nature.
The proper dichotomy would be animal farming versus the best plant-based agriculture. If you want to steelman this argument, you would compare it to veganic regenerative agriculture, and there would be no comparison because you're still exploiting the few remaining wildlife that we have.
So do you mind if I inquire really quick? Like, you're making the claim that hunting might be the most ethical option when it comes to like sustainability and the environment.
I was thinking more like global warming. Sorry. That's all.
What were you saying? You were thinking more what?
Global warming.
Well, yeah. So towards the climate and whatnot. So I have a question for you. What would happen if everybody decided to that was the most ethical option, and everybody decided that it was time to pick up a rifle and go hunt? What do you think would happen?
Then everything would be fucking dead. That's obviously not what I'm arguing for, dude. I'm just saying.
But I understand what you're saying. So with our current model, a person independent of the system, it might appear to be that way. But when you look at it, it's really not, because if everybody did that and applied that logic, then like you said, like everything would be dead. And then with the demand for animals, we'd go right back to animal farming and all these problems that we're trying to address in the first place. That's my point.
It's a good point.
And I think we still are kind of pretty far away from the idea of like, how is hunting actually conservation, right? So like, again, like I would kind of lay out just the bare bones argument for this, is that hunting, like in its core, by definition, is the exploitation of wildlife, right? Whereas conservation is protection and preservation of natural resources. So like at its core, hunting is the exploitation, right, that conservation is trying to prevent or mitigate.
Where did you get that definition from?
Yeah, you can look it up. You can Google it. The Oxford Dictionary, I believe, was where I got the conservation definition.
You said hunting.
Well, what is hunting? Like, how would you describe hunting?
I mean, it's defined as the act of one that hunts, or the process of hunting, or a periodic variation of a speed and synchronous electric machine. Yeah, no. But
I thought we were defining conservation, not hunting.
Yeah, sorry. I mean, hunting. Yeah, I mean, there's tons of definitions for hunting, but do you not like agree that hunting is the exploitation of wild animals, or
Not in all
let's say
senses, no. Not in
more
every case.
specifically the killing of wild animals? Would you say that's more appropriate?
Could you repeat that? Sorry.
Would you say that hunting is the act of killing wild animals or animals?
Yes.
Okay, so how is killing not exploitation? You're making use of their body, right?
Because what if it's going to be benefiting an overall ecosystem?
You're still exploiting it, right? Like you are going and you are taking that animal's life. Are you just digging a hole and burying it to plant a tree or something? Like how are you benefiting the ecosystem?
What if it's doing the same thing to another group of animals? You know, what if it's causing, I don't know, a whole other part of the ecosystem to, collapse?
So you're arguing like to prevent trophic cascades?
Yeah, in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any like realistic situation where that would be the case. And if we're talking about predator culling,
Didn't that happen in Easter Island with the rats or something?
Yeah, there's quite a few different cases. There's a really good book called The New Wild, and it talks about like invasive species or trophic cascades within ecosystems, specifically on islands, because that's the easiest place to test a lot of these theories about invasive species. But yeah, I mean, there's tons of different, more ethical ways to go about controlling the population, whether it be of invasive species or of animals like deer. There's far more ethical ways to go about it that don't involve the exploitation of those animals.
But that's what we deem ethical. Nature is not ethical in a way.
Right.
Do you know what I mean by that?
Nature is indifferent, I would agree.
Yeah.
But we are moral agents. Would you agree to that?
To an extent. I believe that there are certain things that we should not touch,
But wait. So what's the definition of moral agency?
Sorry, what was that? I couldn't hear you over. I was sorry.
What was your definition of moral agency? Because you said there's like things we shouldn't touch, but like moral agency doesn't really like, I don't understand how that's a response to moral agency.
Oh, I was just under the assumption that was, our calling sort of thing. No,
so moral agency means that we have the ability to make moral decisions and to rationalize, right? To like weigh options morally. And make moral judgments, whereas like children or animals or those that can't make moral judgments would be moral patients. So what you're talking about is like trying to apply, moral agency to moral patients, which just wouldn't make sense because moral patients can't make moral decisions, right?
Yeah. Okay. So it's proxy. All right. Well, sorry. Can we go back to what it was? I think I lost track of.
Yeah, all good. So like hunting as conservation, I mean, it sounded, I think you were kind of making the argument of like population control was a justification for conservation. But my argument was that hunting is one of many different ways of controlling populations. But indirectly, actually directly, hunting can impact population controls or impact populations to increase populations. Both through gender bias hunting, which reduces competition for mating.
It also gives more ability for available food, but that's the same thing of what happens when you don't correct that change in nature. If you don't fix the issue before it becomes too much of an issue, then there's going to be the issue of there's no food for anybody now because you didn't take care of this issue.
So do you think hunters and humans can have better impact on, these ecosystems in that way for population control than say coyotes or, native predators?
In some instances, given the,
How so?
that like case area.
How so?
Yeah. Well, I mean, certain areas or certain animals are able to thrive in different environments way better than, anybody could ever expect. the gray wolves or the Canadian wolves that they put into Yellowstone, there was only 11 of them, and now there's over 100 in just a couple of years. So,
but don't you think that's a result?
Growth is an issue.
Don't you think that's a result of the carrying capacity of the ecosystems that they're spreading into, more so than like, you know, a lack of human control or something like that? Like, even
but do you think that they deserve to starve? That's
no. So even predators have natural mechanisms of population control enacted on them through natural means, right? Of carrying capacity. And now you're hinting at like some moral difference between like me directly going and unaliving a coyote or a wolf versus it starving to death. And I think if I choose to pull the trigger on a coyote, it is more immoral than a coyote just naturally starving to death in an ecosystem, obviously, right?
Yes.
So then that argument's moot. So what would be another argument for why we need to control these populations if there are natural means?
They can still become overpopulated. There are several different case studies that have shown that, you know, populations have grown way the hell out of anywhere that they should be, to the point where there are animals, you know, dying of malnutrition or lack of.
But we also know that a lot of those populations are artificially created through the management that hunters are doing, or that Department of Natural Resources are doing for the benefit of hunters. So to argue about population control, we also have to look at the impacts of the land management practices that hunters participate in, as well as state agencies that do it specifically for hunting.
It's also happening a lot in terms of trying to, you know, add natural agents into these areas with the overpopulation issues.
You said natural what?
Natural agents, such as, you know, bringing in ladybugs for an aphid infestation. If you have too many of the deer, they're going to bring in more wolves or coyotes.
Yeah,
that's
so
not always the best thing.
What you're saying, though, is literally what I'm arguing. Like, there are natural mechanisms to control this. So by us getting involved, we typically have, like you were saying, like an anthropocentric view, and we want to exploit the wildlife, you know, so we're going to do land management practices that benefit the wildlife that we want to exploit, rather than looking at the whole ecosystem, you know, that true conservation would do. We would look at the entire ecosystem and say, hey, you know, we're missing predators here, so maybe we should reintroduce predators. Or, hey, there's no mesopredators in this area, maybe we could reintroduce predators, the mesopredators into this area. Or maybe we can change the habitat, you know, to benefit all of these species, rather than just looking directly at one prey species.
But when you do that, it still leaves that room for error of, hey, let's bring in, you know.
So this is like just essentially implying that because there might be an issue, what's the point in not doing it, you know? And that kind of seems to be like not really a logical stance to hold.
I think it is in a way, though. I'm trying to articulate it better, but
yeah, I mean, what I'm hearing is like futility. You're just arguing that if humans don't get involved, you know, there will be some issue. And like I've demonstrated, and I've mentioned many different ways that nature has these mechanisms of population control. And I've also demonstrated how human involvement and our anthropocentric views and our drive for exploitation or consumptive behaviors like hunting actually negatively impacts these ecosystems. So in my argument, I'm still, you know, in a position where I presented tons of evidence for why hunting is not conservation. And now what you're presenting is like an appeal to futility.
Think of like the silver carp, right? That was imported. It was an invasive fish.
Yeah.
That wreaked havoc on, what was it, all 5 major lakes or something? Like some major water bodies. They were also federally protected and couldn't be removed for quite some time. That is not conservation because it killed every other thing in the water and gives you a chance of any competition.
Kill every other thing in the water. That's like pretty disingenuous to say.
That's what I was under the understanding of. If I'm wrong on that, I'm sorry, but
no, I mean, it might have had an effect, but it definitely didn't have that kind of effect.
Yeah, I mean, we've already covered invasive species, in our discussion here
Yeah,
as well.
I
And
was
the
here for
fact
that
that
too. Yeah.
that there are, more ethical ways to approach invasive species that don't involve, the exploitation of these species or the harm to these species. There's relocation, there's addressing reproductive cycles. There's a lot of different means to address these species that we do see as having either widespread harm to biodiversity or widespread harm to economics within the human society. So to argue that hunting or fishing is the only means of control is disingenuous, and is still, in my view, the exploitation. Because if we were to try to argue that we should like pay hunters or fishermen to go out and try to catch as many carp as they can, you're incentivizing the exploitation of nature, which is the opposite, definitionally of conservation. So again, we've just proven the point that hunting is not conservation.
But is it not fair to say that nature can get out of whack, and when that happens, you need that conservation to come in?
Yeah,
Whether
but
it's
again,
in some form, right? In the form of hunting, though, it is a valid form. It may not be the most effective. It may not be the most ethically correct. I'm not disagreeing with that. I'm not trying to, have a false dichotomy in anything that I'm saying. But
I just want to mention really quick too, it's important to note that ecosystems are constantly going to be changing, whether it be slow or fast. An invasive species that's introduced to that ecosystem might have an immediate impact on it, but over time it's eventually going to just coexist and either evolve the ecosystem or create a new ecosystem that can thrive just as good. A lot of these thoughts on, our interpretation of an invasive species and what our model image of their ecosystem should look like, that's our opinion, like it's not really an issue without our practices, it's going to happen.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, I've given all the time that I'm going to give for this. Thank you guys for giving me the chance to speak finally. I wish you guys a great rest of your night.
Yeah, likewise. Have a good weekend.
And by the way, great debaters.
Sweet. Thanks, man. Peace.
Peace.
All right. I think that might be the last guest, but I'm down to respond to some comments here. Been on for quite a few hours, so anything else y'all wanted to say, Ozark or Andy?
No, I mean, we had some good discussions. We had some weird discussions. I mean, it's par for the course, but
I thought what was interesting was, considering the topic, we had far less kind of loose cannons or people that lost their temper or any of those things than what you would usually get in a vegan live.
Yeah. Yep, I did notice that too.
Which I actually, and I'm more than happy to admit that would be kind of some sort of internalized stereotyping, but I expected it to be the other way around.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, props for that at least.
For sure. Yeah, I think we've had some really good, like, genuine discussions and debates. So I very much appreciate that. And yeah, I feel like sometimes when the framework is all like the whole topic is just veganism, people come in like ready to like, just be angry and get mad. But like something like this, I feel like it is very controversial. But when you hear the facts and, different opinions that are like, okay, like I can kind of see where you're coming from. And then you can spin that into a lot more of the ethical approaches and the ethical reasons, why we make those decisions. And that can lead into, more thoughts about it. So, but let's see some weird, silly comments. I see them flowing in. So, and we've had like 100 people steady in here, like since I started. So that's been pretty solid.
It was preaching nearly 200 for a little while, 189, 191, that sort of number for a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, I was actually pretty excited to see that because I barely see those kind of numbers, especially in lives like this.
Yeah. part of me wonders if it is just being a Saturday, but yeah, I don't know. I'll definitely be doing some more of these throughout the week. So anybody in the comments, if you want to come continue to ask your silly questions in the comments, please follow me.
I did want to mention though, really quick, I am a little bit disappointed. I had high hopes for the last guest, saying that he was a conservation major and been studying it extensively, and it seemed like most of the arguments really had nothing to do with conservation.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of things, that he's probably very well educated on, and I think he followed me, so I'll definitely check out his page and see what he's got going on. But yeah, I mean, I was young, fresh out of school, and I thought I had a good, grasp on hunting, and I was still hunting at that age as well. So I mean, it's something you got to run into people with different opinions, and I never really had my opinions on conservation challenged until way later in life. So it's awesome, to see young people kind of coming up.
Yeah, I mean, we also have to appreciate that obviously all of that education and everything else and knowledge, so to speak, has been acquired as a speciesist. And so their personal accountability or the sort of responsibility that comes with their actions has never been sort of coincided with that. It's not like me, for example, that knew nothing about any of this subject before I went vegan. And so I came into it with an understanding of like, right, what's my impact here? If you're not thinking about that and you've already kind of like absolved yourself from this situation, then of course you're going to know all this information and you'll be very knowledgeable on the subject, but you're not making those connections because you've already kind of disconnected from the get-go. You might find that with a few more dots connected and a few more conversations about speciesism, that it'll actually be like, hang on a minute. Yes, that all clicks now.
Yeah, I wasn't trying to like specifically trash on him or anything. I was just kind of like, I got super excited. I'm like, oh, conservation major. This is going to get all like extremely data driven, but we focused more on like other aspects of, hunting than specifically conservation. That's all I was expressing.
Yeah, true. I kind of forgot he had said that about his background when we got so deep into the debate.
Yeah.
But yeah, it just shows though, doesn't it? Because I mean, I certainly wasn't trying to assume that you made a dig, like you didn't in any way, shape, or form. And I think how you addressed the cultural part initially was great because it was kind of like, right, let's start here. But yeah, I just think that at the moment, although he's got all of that obviously education and knowledge, we never tapped into any of that. We just dealt with cultural speciesism and the same normal conversations that you'd have with anyone, right? So he might as well have been, for the purpose of this conversation, working in an office doing admin, because all of that knowledge didn't really come into play. And so that's what I'm talking about. Once you get past those barriers, that's when he might see, hang on a minute, actually this makes a whole bunch of sense.
Yeah, for sure. I knew that's what you were saying. I was just like expressing. So
I feel like a lot of times, like with institutional education, you get that like very core foundation of education, right? Like the functions of conservation, the ecological functions, within an ecosystem. Like, and for me, like studying computer science, like I got very core stuff that just wasn't even relevant to like the field I was actually going into. So I think a lot of times like having that institutional education can be like a good foundation, but it's up to you as an individual to like go out and like specialize in those things and really grasp like the ethics or, like all of these different aspects to, what you want to do in your career or, what you're trying to study. And a lot of times like institutional education can like really leave a lot of that important stuff behind, at least in my experience.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been fun, y'all. I think I'm going to go ahead and end here. Appreciate everybody hanging out. Appreciate you, Scott and Andy, coming up and helping me out.
Thank you for
having us up and hosting today.
Yeah, no worries. We'll have some more. We'll see y'all later.
Take care.
Yeah.